to hearing about that at some point, we hope. And I've got Siobhan in Dublin, fantastic. It just amazes me, isn't it? They just keep on appearing. People just, it's fantastic, way of working. Hi, Joanna, nice to have you with us. Okay, so it seems to have slowed down a little bit, although there are still people joining. So could I ask those of you that are not presenting at the moment, would you mind turning off your cameras and turning off your microphones just while we do introductions, and then we will begin. Zita, you're going to do the thing is I'm going to introduce Michael, and that's that, isn't it? Yeah, okay. Okay, well, welcome everybody. Welcome to the University of Wolverhampton, and welcome to the book seminar on innovative research methods in early years, looking at research methods beyond the conventional. We're very excited to be sharing all of our ideas with you today and sharing some extracts from the book and some of our research approaches, and hopefully you'll find it really, really interesting and useful. And so while you're still arriving, if you don't mind just putting in the chat who you are and where you're from, that's lovely. And in the meantime, I'm going to hand over to Professor Michael Joplin, who's the Director of the Education Observatory at the University of Wolverhampton, who will set us off for today's session. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Helen. Oh, I've got an echo. Right, so as Helen said, my name is Michael Joplin. Those of you who don't know me, I'm Professor of Education at the Education Observatory at the University of Wolverhampton. And I'm just going to say a little bit, and it's not going to take 15 minutes, don't worry, I'll leave time for you all to speak, which is more important. This is the third early years kind of seminar, event, conference, whatever we want to call it, that we've had since about November, I think. And so it's pleasing and exciting that so many people are still finding time and are interested enough to join them, which is why we're doing them. So thank you particularly to Zita and to Helen for organising it and doing the kind of pulling things together. We have got 7 people, I think, talking today. So 7 people from 4 different universities and 2 different countries. And the focus, as Helen said, is about innovative research methods in early years. So it's based on the book that came out a while back now. But it's interesting to see the kind of range of issues we've got. So we've got people looking at Jackie looking at reflexivity broadly. We've got looked at video, looking at arts and creativity. And then Zita and Gavin talking about cue methodology. So I think that shows the range, and there's more in the book. It's more for you to investigate. And I just want to make kind of 2 points early on, and then I'll pass over to actually get the speakers to start speaking. And I think the first thing to say is that in the Education Observatory we do a reasonable amount of early years research, and we link in with the early childhood experts in our Institute of Education. But I still think kind of early years is overlooked, particularly in the kind of pandemic and post-pandemic debates and world that we're in at the moment. And I'd like to think, because we talk about, there's all this nonsense talk about learning loss and earning loss and all this kind of stuff, which is basically made up. But I think if we focus on early years, it's a way of broadening our perspective and thinking actually there are very important things that very young children are losing out on because of the pandemic, and we need to focus on that. And the way we need to do that is obviously in terms of research. So if we can do innovative research, learn more about innovative research methods, and I think there's often in kind of generic or kind of broad education research, early years are seen as a different area, and young children are difficult because there's only limited participation. Well, I think what we'll hear today is that the opposite of that, and we can learn quite a lot in the kind of broad and general education research as well as early years research. About how we can use methods, how we can focus on how children learn, how they develop, how they play, and integrate some of that into the research methods that we use. So there's the people talk today. There's the other sections in the book which are all interesting and worth looking at. So that's all I want to say really. So thank you all for joining. We've got I can't see how many, but an awful lot of people, which shows the importance and the interest there is. And I will pass over now to, I think, is it Jackie who's speaking first?
You're handing back to Zita for housekeeping.
Handing back to Zita. There you go, Zita. Thank you. I hope everyone enjoys today, and there you go. Over to you, Zita.
Thanks very much, Michael. Thank you. So we just wanted to say a couple of things before we started, if that's okay. As Helen said, it would be great if everyone could turn off their cameras. There's still a couple of people with their cameras on, and I don't know if it's a bit difficult, I think, seeing if you have got your camera turned off. So if you can all just check that there is a line through your camera, that would be great. And please stay muted while people are presenting, because there can be an echo, and obviously there could be interruption otherwise while people are presenting. But each presenter will ask for questions. Most, I think, are asking at the end of their presentations, but please also put comments into the chat. That would be great, and then Helen and I can pick up some of those comments to ask the presenters at the end of their presentations too. We are recording this event. We do that with all of our online events, and the recording will be put on our Education Observatory website afterwards, and will remain, I believe, in the Teams link for, I think it's a month or something like that after we've done this conference, this book seminar, and some feedback from the event will be written up and put on the Education Observatory website as well. And yeah, it's great that everyone's automatically introducing themselves, so please do that. If you haven't already done so, please introduce yourself in the chat, and let us know where you're located. That would be great. So I'm going to hand back over to Helen to introduce our first presenter. Thanks, Helen.
That's lovely. Thank you, Zita. Just a reminder, a couple of people have just arrived. If you could, Sharon, I think you've got your camera on. If you wouldn't mind turning that off, that would be lovely. And we're going to kick off with Dr. Jackie Musgrave, who's going to be our first presenter today. Jackie is Programme Lead for Early Childhood Education Studies, primary at the Open University, and her research brings together her experiences as a registered sick children's nurse, as well as a teacher in early childhood. And the focus of her research is to identify the role of practitioners in reducing and removing those barriers that affect health and create problems for very young children. So she's looking at inclusivity. However, today, Jackie has 2 chapters in the book that we're talking about today. She's obviously very experienced in her research, and she's going to talk to us today about one of the things that I find most difficult to explain when I'm teaching research methods, and I find difficult to do. So I'm very pleased that she's going to share with us her chapter on reflexivity and really talk about how that impacts our designing and using our research. So thank you, Jackie. Over to you when you're ready.
Thank you very much, Helen. I'm just getting up my presentation. I'll be with you in just a moment. Right, good afternoon, everybody. I take it, Helen, that you can see my first slide on the screen?
I can, you're all ready, thank you.
Lovely, thanks. I was so pleased to be asked to write contributions to this very important book. Well, first of all, you can see there's a photograph of campus. I think people are always amazed that we've got this enormous campus down in Milton Keynes, that when we don't actually have that many students who come on campus except for our postgrad. And the reason for including that was that this presentation was originally prepared for a conference that was planned to be held last year. And it's called, I'm just checking my wall for my certificate, International Conference on Education Quality. And this was held in Morocco. And very interestingly, the book that this seminar is based on has either been or is being translated into Arabic. So that was a great gift to be able to take with me to the conference, and sadly it was, of course, postponed. But this book is reaching around the world, and so great accolade to Helen and Zita's work on the book and all of the people who have contributed. So The aim of this session for the next 25 minutes or so, 20-25 minutes, is just to foreground how important reflexivity is in relation to producing high quality early childhood educational research. We're going to look at what it is, and I'm going to talk about my own doctoral research to illustrate the point. So this presentation draws on the book, and it also draws on my own thesis. I completed it about 7 years ago now. And specifically, it looks at the peer-reviewed literature relating to reflexivity that I drew on and included in my thesis. And just to give a bit more background as to why reflexivity has emerged as this very important feature, part of our methodological approach. And it really is rooted in the contrast, if you like, between quantitative and qualitative research. On the left, we have some of the features. This is obviously a very simplistic view of what the features of quantitative research, seen as scientific, factual, looking at big numbers. So therefore, you get a wide range of data, but perhaps you see it's much more shallow. You don't see the story behind the data. And one of the things that is generally attributed as a feature of quantitative research is how generalizable it is, and to across groups of people in different situations. So the features of qualitative research primarily belonging to the social sciences, and as I've said, an opportunity to look at the stories behind the numbers, looking at the people, looking at the humanity. Focus quite often on small numbers of participants and subjective, and this is where the reflexivity link can really come to the fore. The opportunity to look deeply into an issue, very focused and much more likely to be context specific. And how come when I'm in front of 200 people do I only just see my spelling error and not when I thought I had looked carefully earlier? So apologies for that. So it's just an illustration again of the quantitative versus qualitative. Here on the left, panoramic, a big picture. Here on the right, really focusing in, looking at fine detail. When I first started doing research, which was a long, long time ago as part of my certificate of education, I can remember reading in Judith Bell's book, that very important and still highly regarded book, about how you have to put aside the fact that you can remove bias from your research, your educational research. And I think that took me quite a while to get my thoughts around. And so by admitting that there is bias in what you choose to research is a really important step. And Denscombe says here, one of the reasons we choose our research questions is because we are so deeply interested in whatever it is. So how can we portray or provide a fair and balanced picture? But it's really important that we try to do that, and there are important reasons why. So before we look into this in more detail, what is reflexivity? Well, it's to do with self-awareness and reflection. And as Olesen says here, it goes beyond mere reflection. It demands a steady and uncomfortable assessment of the interpersonal and interstitial knowledge. And John Oates, Professor John Oates, one of my colleagues at the Open University, he offers this definition. And John won't mind me saying that he has worked at the Open University for over 50 years. So he has lived this change, if you like, an approach to research, and has often fed into and shaped our understanding. And this is his quite recent revisit, if you like, of a definition of reflexivity, and he says, as qualitative research has emerged and matured, there is a realization that such subjectivity, defined as the quality of being influenced or informed by one's own opinion, should be recognized and explored as part of the methodology of research. So he's very clearly saying we can't ignore it. We have to identify it, grasp it, and convey our thoughts. And I see reflexivity as being part of that ethical thread that should be running through all of our research. And it starts while we're even thinking. It's not just that, as we know, the ethics aren't just filling in the form, sending it off, getting consent, anonymity, all of those things. It's a much deeper thread that we need to keep hanging on to, and ensuring it's strong and robust. And one of the reasons why we need this constant reflection is to help us to interpret the data and what is the meaning that we are finding from our research. And I always like Canella and Lincoln's quote, or question, if you like, this provocation: how do I assemble myself as an ethical researcher? And again, by exploring reflexivity and pinning it down is key to that. So what have we talked about so far? To summarize what I've said, that a central argument is that qualitative research is not a voyage of discovery that starts with a clean sheet. You cannot be completely objective, you can't be unbiased. But what you have to do is start exploring within yourself what it is that's motivating you. And I would urge any researcher to embrace reflexivity as a methodological tool to help to convey transparency. And I think along with transparency, promoting a confidence in your research. So how do we do reflexivity? Where do we start? And this is sometimes a really challenging position to be in. And what I found is, although I eventually identified my reflexivity, and I will go into that in a moment, it actually keeps emerging and unfolding, because my research that I started as part of my doctoral research journey isn't something that I've just put aside and shoved in the box under the bed. It continues to evolve, and I continue to find reasons why this area of research and the questions I'm posing for myself captivate me so much. So Wellington said one of the really important things to recognize is that your life history is part of you, and therefore it's going to be part of your research, and it can't just be put aside. And we can't suspend our beliefs or separate our experience, delete memories. Whatever we are is inextricably linked with all of the different stages of our research and beyond our research. Now, if we had time, we would be doing this. I'd be stopping talking, giving you a few minutes and getting you to think about your own life history. Now, of course, if we're going to do this as researchers, or if we're going to do it with our students, for those of you who are working with students, would probably require some considerable time and a bit of a health warning, because it may well be that some uncomfortable feelings can be provoked by such an activity, but it's a really useful activity to do, going right back to the beginning and tracking your life and finding out the answers to some of these points here. How have our life events impacted upon how we approach life, what our beliefs are, who we are, and so on. And hopefully by doing this, you may find that some of the information will shine a light on why it is you are so interested. The other theoretical concept that I drew on in order to identify what my motivation was for my research was to use Brookfield's lenses. And he said that by putting on a different pair of lenses, it gives us a different perspective or a different vantage point. And the analogy being that this can help you to see the world more clearly. So in relation to my thesis, and what I was looking at was how practitioners, the foundation degree students that I had been working with, how had they responded to the needs of children with chronic health conditions, and how had they created an inclusive environment for children. And so what I did was I realized that I had 4 different perspectives or lenses to look through. As Helen said, I have trained as a registered sick children's nurse. I worked at Birmingham Children's Hospital. That was after doing my registered general nursing. So I had worked with children with asthma for many years and seen children coming into the practice when I was a practice nurse with a great deal of greatly influenced in a negative way in most cases by the symptoms of the conditions that they were having, that they had been diagnosed with. I also realized that my experience and my lens as a mother had influenced it, because my daughter had eczema. So I had living proof, if you like, from that point of view of how it impacted upon her life. I drew on my experiences as a teacher because, and this is really important, because I had made an assumption that everybody understood about how conditions, chronic ongoing conditions, could affect young children. And I was so surprised to realize that there wasn't any literature to underpin, if you like, this concept of how children could be excluded. So then my 4th perspective was that as a researcher, this was how I identified the gap in the literature where there was a need for more research. And I'm just going to touch on eczema a little bit here. The word eczema comes from the Greek word meaning to boil, and this is because it can be so incredibly painful and disruptive to children's lives. It's the most common skin condition that children present at the GPs with, and it causes intense itching, and it impacts upon all areas of their lives, including sleep, and it can be provoked, the symptoms, the breakdown in the skin can be provoked or triggered by contact with a whole range of different substances such as water, soap, sand, modelling clay and paint. So of course all the staples of early childhood and sensory play. And really importantly, it can't be cured, but the condition can be managed. And this, of course, is where practitioners come in. So as I was trying to unpick all of the different perspectives, I realized that I had gone to visit a student in placement, and there was an 8-month-old baby sitting in a baby chair, and he had such profound eczema that the creases of his elbows and his hands and his knees and his ankles were really angry looking and broken down. And what really drew my attention to him was that he had socks on his hands. And the key person of this little boy said the reason for that is if we don't put the socks over his hands, he will just scratch himself so much that he will draw blood. And so what they did was they put on the gloves on his hands, and then when the key person could give him some one-to-one, and at the time I was observing this, it was children were eating their food, so she was able to go over, take the gloves off him and play with him and distracted from scratching himself. And so I was thinking, well, what about his ankles? You know, 8-month-old baby, they can't reach down. And at the same time, there was an account of a man who had locked-in syndrome, and he was trying to argue that he should end his life because of his quality of life. And he was actually conveying or illustrating the discomfort, to use a word that probably doesn't encapsulate that adequately, by saying, imagine what it's like if you've got an intense itch on your ankle and you can't reach it to scratch it. So all of these connections are coming into my head. And I was left so much with that baby and the difficulties he was having and how the practitioners were managing it. But I was thinking, what if he's got gloves, socks on his hands for a large proportion of his day? What about his fine motor development and whirling sort of thoughts like that? So that was where part of my reflexivity emerged from. So this is something that you may want to do if you're thinking about your research and all those questions, the who, what, why, when, just scribbling them down and trying to pin down what it is that is motivating you to ask your research question. Now, one of the things that I found was really, really useful was to keep a research journal. And again, it's quite some time later, probably when I was preparing for the chapter for the book that we're talking about today, was to keep this research journal. And what I found was I was getting all my ranting out on the pages and my highly emotive language, and my deepest thoughts, really. And so that got it out in a first draft. Now I know that we're human beings and therefore we like to just get stuff down and get it done, and we don't necessarily like to go back to it. But I think reflexivity and conveying that, or developing how we can convey that in our writing, is something that absolutely needs more than one go at. And what you can do is, if you get it down there, you kind of park those thoughts, you can then go back and you can start sifting out the language, because what is so important, of course, is that whatever you're writing is going to be in the public domain. And one of the ethical strands of reflexivity and how you convey that for the world to see will literally be there. Nowadays, all of our theses are out, available to everybody. So you want to be able to write in a way that no matter who reads it will not be upset and harmed, which of course goes back to this ethical thread. I'm coming up to my time, so very quickly I'll just say that there's a real skill in how we convey our reflexivity. There can be sometimes a tendency to be overly introspective and what's called navel gazing. So we're just looking at one little bit, and we can end up losing the bigger picture. As I've said, it's so important not to be critical, because quite often what we want to research is something that means so much to us, and it may well have been a very uncomfortable or painful part of our lives that has piqued our curiosity as to why we want to look at it. So that can be a real skill, and this is where engaging the help of others is really important to do. Have you got the tone right? Is what you are writing readable by anybody without causing concern or harm? Being reflexive, a strength is how it can help you to challenge your assumptions and beliefs, and it does really illuminate the humanity of research. What is it that we are trying to bring to share to improve whatever it is for in our case, the children and families that we work with and work for. So that's a summary. I don't think I need to go through all of that again, but I hope that has really been helpful as just a sort of flavour of what reflexivity is, why it's so important, how in inverted commas to start doing it, and some of the benefits of addressing it in your research. Do get in touch if you want to. And Helen, I will hand back to you.
Oh, thank you very much, Jackie. That was absolutely fascinating. Some very positive comments coming through about how powerful stories are, but about how we think about those stories is really, really crucial. A couple of comments about the idea of using those lenses. And I think that's certainly, I know you supported me through my doctoral journey, and that idea of using the lenses and looking at our subject from different perspectives was so important to really get to the nub of what it is we were trying to find out and what it is we wanted to do. What I'm really excited about for you, Jackie, is that we've got a couple of, I think, PhD students or maybe undergraduate students talking about getting together to share their ideas about research based on being stimulated by what you've said there. So that's really brilliant. And we've got comments here saying it was really insightful, informative, lots to take away for PhD research. And Joe Alvin Clark's talking about here about appreciating the point that you're making about being balanced and being understandable. And I think this is one of the key bits. It's about making it real and being honest about who you are and what it is that's driving you to research. So some nice comments, and thank you very much, Jackie. So I'm going to hand back to Zita
Absolute
now.
pleasure, thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to hand back to Zita now, who's going to introduce our next speaker. She says, hopefully.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you. Okay, so next we have Elisabetta Biffi, who is a researcher in pedagogy at the University of Milan Bicocca. She's going to talk about arts as a research method. I'm really sorry if I pronounced the university incorrectly, Elisabetta.
That's fine. Milano Bicocca, it's quite fine. It's not easy. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for this invitation and this opportunity for sharing with you our work. I'm talking virtually with my colleagues Franca Zuccoli and Lucia Carriera. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, because something was total blank. So I'm trying to share my slides, just a quick feedback if everything is fine and you can see my screen.
It's all good, Elisabetta, thank you.
Great, thank you. So as I was saying, I'm speaking this presentation is virtually with my colleagues Franca Zuccoli and Lucia Carriera, and I have the honor to introduce you our chapter context and our ideas and suggestions that are from our work on using arts as a method of research and using arts as a method of a strategy of education with early childhood education and care services, teachers and social workers in general. So just to give you some key points of this presentation, just a couple of them. The first is that we're moving from recognizing the value of artistic and expressive medium, which is represented from artistic languages for children and adults during a research context and within a research framework. But even considering the research, the artistic processes itself as a mode of research. As we have seen, a lot of artists have to be considered a researcher, and the main works such as the ones from Leonardo da Vinci, for instance, just for saying a name. He was a scientist, of course, but he was an artist as well, and the whole process of knowledge and construction of knowledge that he was producing throughout his work was supported by drawings, by written text, by artistic operas in different ways. So somehow we stressed how how the artistic process of is by itself an art research process, and that researchers from different disciplines can use this kind of approach to the research, artistic languages, sorry, for their own research, especially when we are focusing on object of study which are close to the human life and human beings, and that is part of the complexity of the word experience. So moving back to our chapter, one of the first part of our reflection was focused on art and children, considering the role of art in early childhood education. And we can see that for the first step for all of us is to try to define what we can define as art. And we use the expression given by Dino Formaggio, who was an important exponent of our artistic tradition, that describe art is all that men can call art. So at the end, we have to define by them ourselves what is art, and what is has to be considered art is part of a shared experience among the community, the artistic and not only academic communities, and is something which is produced by a cultural acknowledgement of something which can be considered as an artistic project and a product, as an artistic object. So from this perspective, we can even consider the educational product, ones who were created by children during their work, as some form of art in terms of expression of a community, which is the community of the early childhood education care services, or with general terms, the community of what we can define as childhood pedagogy, childhood culture in general. So our references, we moved from the work of John Dewey that argued that the formative power of art lies precisely in this, in the experiential dimension. So within the possibility to engage in a constant and intensive activity, which is a reflexive activity, and then an activity in terms of exploration, in terms of reflection, in terms of definition of one's own position in front of the object of standard study. So it's even something related to be engaged in the knowledge process by itself. So Dewey support us in focusing on the practical work from one side and on the reflection on the other side. And in these terms, what is important in an educational process is to be able to find the balance between both the practical work and the reflective moment, which have not to be considered separated, but have to be considered as integrated and recursive part of the same process, in avoiding a division between the theory and the practice from one side and the other. And another reference for us was what Herbert Fritz described in terms of thinking about the child reality as a total organic experience, when even the body has to be considered, and even the body is the first instrument of knowledge, the first medium for between the inner world and the natural world, the world outside the child. And in this sense, educating through art means support and give children a possibility for integral experience in the movement where there is the importance of the recognition of the inner states and the physical engagement of in the process of exploration of the reality. And one other aspect is related to the aesthetic impulse, to the aesthetic dimension, which is seems to be, has not to be considered as a technical or as a something a skill only for the ones who are in charge of working with art. So from a complete different perspective, we have to move back to the consideration of an aesthetic impulse as something which is at the basis of human experience of knowledge, which is not something only that is connected with the technical competencies, technical skills, but is even related to the human being experience of lived knowledge and lived learning. So, having said that, what about the methods and the research? We try to focus on the definition that McNiff given us about what is art, what arts-based methods are. That is the systematic use of the artistic process, as I was trying to say before, talking about Leonardo, as a primary way of understanding and examining experience. So it's not something that is comes after the experience, but is something which is inside the same experience of learning and the same experience of exploring reality. In that way, in that sense, artistic process is the primary mode of inquiry, and is a very intuitive, somehow even naive way of exploring reality. But in terms of being able to use this kind of languages for the research aims and for research purposes, of course, the researchers have to be aware of the technique, have to be aware of the main aspect of the artistic languages that is going or she's going to use. And in these terms, even though arts can be the artistic experience and the aesthetical experience is something that we can even reach without any form of professional knowledge of technique. If we want to use that in order to inform our research, then in this case we have to be aware of the technical dimension of those languages. And on the other side, we can have even arts-informed research methods, which are the ones where the artist, is not the artistic process to be used in terms of a research process, but we are using artistic languages in order to inform our own methods of research, somehow adapting what is from the artistic world to the research process. In this case, the researcher is not an artist, but is able as well to consider his or her limits in managing this kind of languages, and maybe it's going to involve in the research team some artists, someone who is more aware about this kind of technical dimensions. So if we look at the early childhood education settings in general, we will see that even the artistic languages and artistic products have always been used for informing or for developing somehow the research on children. One example is given by the children drawings, which have been used for the study of the cognitive development of children and their representational perspective of the world, and even in term for developing the knowledge on the textual comprehension and literacy. And somehow even the children drawings have been used for as a specific mode of inquiry in order to reach to reach an inner knowledge of the children's perspective on the world. And again, the language of art also has been used for facilitating the work in multicultural settings, where not only there was the challenge or in the challenge related to the communication verbally in a multicultural context, but even when we have to work with some complex topics, some complex issues which with which we have the risk to get lost in translation, in terms of transferring the cultural meanings of some words or of some key concept. Again, we have even to consider the power of art in doing research with children. So all the kind of studies which are referred to the process of research, which are focused on the engagement or the involvement of children as researchers, as co-researchers, so to give voice to multiple perspectives and even to multiple languages. And in this kind, it could be even considered as a key opportunity at the ethical level, considering that if we are working with the early childhood educational settings, we will have to face the limit of working with children. And so in terms of making their aware of the consequences or of the meanings of the research process in which they have to be involved. So somehow we needed to move through a different medium, and the artistic language and the drawing as well can be considered an important vector for passing some information referred to our research. So, in general, we can say that art can be considered a research strategy when working with children. And some main example we can find some main example in even in the contemporary debate. But one point for us really important was to stress that sometimes art is considered as a subject within the early childhood education and care services, and even in primary school somehow. So considering art as a subject means focusing on a specific form of art and focusing on the idea that the art is something that have to be studied somehow. And instead, we just want to stress that considering art as a research strategy means involving children in considering themselves as researchers, which means even give them the instruments and the techniques in order to allow them to collect their own data from their own perspective, which is a children perspective and not an adult's perspective. And this means even modify somehow the techniques and the instruments by themselves, not just giving them. And because what we noticed working along the years with on these topics with teachers is that somehow the context is created in terms of, is a very adult-centered context, even when the teachers are using artistic languages or artistic techniques or instruments or approaches in their own work, educational research. Somehow they were always, the setting is always created maintaining the adult at the center. So we have to, yes, we have to be somehow even proud, why not, to use a different perspective, putting the children at the center, which means even adapting our own strategies and our own idea of knowledge research process in order to allow their own perspective as the right one for our research. And one example, of course, is given by the Mosaic Approach, where the photography is viewed as an artistic language from one perspective, but where the aesthetic dimension of the picture becomes an integral part of the research data to be shared and discussed with the children themselves. So the photography is used in a way that allows not only the importance of the product, the picture, but also the importance of the process that is informed by an aesthetic perspective and not only by a functional perspective. So we used as well art even as a research strategy for working with children. And one of the examples was given by a course that Franca gave to the Hangar Bicocca, which is a contemporary art museum in Milan, quite close to our university, and very that is used for, was used, but I hope so it will be even in the future, as the class for the course of for the Franca's course on didactic and museums. And she used the pedagogical documentation as one strategy for supporting teachers and yes, supporting teachers in considering themselves as researchers and trying to develop and enhance their competencies and their teaching experience on a reflective process through pedagogical documentation, used as a form of documentation that can be used in a museum as a whole, as a form of documentation for the artistic products, for an exhibition, for instance. And we worked on the connection between artistic language and pedagogical documentation. So, moving to my conclusion, we can see that art and education, or artistic languages for the educational research and for the work with teachers within educational contexts, and as well for the research process with children, engaging children in the research by themselves, could offer us three different perspectives. The first was supporting us in the elicitation of meanings. Art can allow the elicitation of inner meanings, the ones that are not visible through verbal channel or other channel of communication. But it requires technical competencies of the researchers in order to identify the right technique based on the participant skills, in order to be even ethically correct. The artistic language used or the artistic technique used has to be yes, has to be considered. It has to make the participants comfort in a comfort zone. It has not to be too much challenges for them. And the second perspective is that shared process of the artistic languages can be used for sharing process of knowledge, and arts can support the shared process of knowledge building, of course, but it requires attention, identifying again the better form, even for the dissemination of the results in order to be understood. And we have a lot of examples that, for instance, exhibition has been used for sharing, for the dissemination of the research results, for instance, but sometimes the form that this kind of exhibition used were not coherent with the research aim and with the perspective of their participants. So we have to be aware of which kind of language we want to use, and the ones who are more coherent with their own research project mission somehow. The third and last one is about children engagement in research. Art can be used for enhancing children's engagement, but again it requires a high level of attention, and from the researcher's perspective, even for not considering the product more important than the process, for not considering art as a subject of study, but considering art as a process of exploration where we can even get lost, we can even make mistakes, and even, yes, not to reach the results that we were hoping to reach. And this is just some references from the works that we used for developing our chapter, and this is my thank you for you all.
Thank you so much, Elisabetta. That was so interesting. Can I just, there is a lot of comments, which is great, on the chat. Lots of comments about art as a research method, the use of the Mosaic approach, the use of pedagogical documentation. There's loads of questions. Can I just ask though, does anybody want to pop their audio and camera on and ask a question directly to Elisabetta? In which case I'll go through some of the comments. Just bear with me because I'm just scrolling up quite a fair amount. So Joe had written, Leonardo as a role model is such an interesting viewpoint, isn't it? The idea of a researcher as an observer, a modeler, a drawer, an artist. So using the language and process of art as a way to make sense as a researcher. It's really interesting, isn't it? And then Nicola added to that. She agreed with what Joe said, and has put how interesting to think of the artistic process as an alternative lens that we can bring to understand things in a new way.
Yeah. If I just have a brief comment, is about what we have not described, but is part of our process, is about the loose parts and the work with this kind of contemporary arts form, which are using objects in a different way, and in a complete different way, and at the opposite of what objects are supposed to be used for. And I think that this is one important direction of investigation, especially working with early childhood.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Elisabetta. Kate's also wrote a comment here saying this approach fits beautifully through a music lens when you exchange the language of art to the language of music. I'm just double checking. There's another one that just scrolling back down. Quite a lot of comments about the Mosaic approach. Maria has wrote a comment saying, love the Mosaic approach. We've used photography to understand young children's experiences in the museum, how they engage with the museum objects, what they like, what they don't like. That's really great. Do you have anything more to add about that, Elisabetta, before we move?
Well, about the museum, what is interesting, and we are discovering during this year of pandemic emergency, is that children are Franca wrote a book called Into the Pocket of Children, because she was the theory of the book was that if you look at into the pockets of children, you will find a lot of small objects and very different objects, which can be used for the exhibition of their own perspective, or what is interesting and what is not, and for everything can be important and interesting from their own perspective. And but is not what is interesting is to explore why that specific object can be so important, and which is the aesthetic idea, the aesthetic way of thinking that guide the children for choosing exactly this small object and not important object from one adult perspective. So it's really important to consider them in a very serious way, and allowing them, recognizing and somehow giving them the legitimation of think about their own perspective in looking at the world from a very serious way, a very important and aware and competent perspective.
That's so great. I've got so many comments are coming up on the screen. I can't catch up with where they are actually. Quite a few people have said that they were nodding furiously at what you were saying, especially describing the objects in children's pockets. Joe's written the thing power. There are so many comments on there, Elisabetta. What I would love you to do, if that's okay, is to if you could have a look through and comment back for some of them, that would be great, if that's okay. Thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to hand back over to Helen now to introduce the next presenter. Thank you.
Thank you, Zita, and thank you, Elisabetta. You need to go back and read all of those comments. They are fabulous. You've really set the chat box alight. It's been fantastic and giving people lots of food for thought. So I'm hoping Helen Linden is with us and ready. Helen Linden is our next presenter, and she's going to talk about using drawing methods with young children. So a real sort of continuation of the theme at the moment, looking at how we can use art and creativity with children. Helen's the postgraduate programme lead at the Centre for Research in Early Childhood, that's CREC in Birmingham, for those of you who are members there and have engaged with Eczema. You'll know Helen through that, as well as she's the UK country coordinator for the European Early Childhood Research Association. Helen's got a history working in primary school, especially in mathematics, which is interesting. She's done a master's degree while teaching in children's centres, and then came to work with us at the University of Wolverhampton, working on undergraduate and postgraduate courses. And now she's doing her doctoral research focusing on pedagogic mediation. So a nice connection between the last presentation and this presentation. And so I'm going to hand over to Helen, and I'll shut up and let's listen to what she has to say. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you so much, Helen. I'm hoping that I have successfully managed to share my screen and that you can see and hear me.
Yep, okay, it's all good.
Fabulous, excellent news. Right, yes, so thank you for that introduction. And it's lovely to see so many friends of CREC here in the chat today. So that's been quite nice to sort of scroll through the chat and see just how many people you've managed to reach with this. My slot here in terms of this book seminar is very much about my chapter, which is the use of drawing methods. And it's actually really heartening to sit here and listen to Elisabetta and to Jackie, because I'm really hoping you'll all see the thread. And my chapter follows Elisabetta's chapter in the book, and as it does today. And hopefully the threads that she's just started to unpick with you all there around the Mosaic approach and around drawing, you'll see, I'm hoping, as we go through this little presentation for you all. So, as Helen's already told you, the background of the chapter is indeed that it's part of a doctoral study. I took the potentially unnecessary step of publishing whilst on my doctoral journey rather than actually waiting till I finished and handed it in, which in itself presents challenges, but the doctoral study is now pretty much at the end. I'm just dragging myself over the line, and the chapter that I've written that specifically focuses in on the drawn written methods with the children is just a really thin slice of the overall approach. It is a very reflexive doctorate that I undertook. It is very much mine. My positionality, I think, sort of radiates from it at all points, and hopefully I haven't done any of the navel gazing that Jackie mentioned in her presentation earlier today. I certainly didn't intend to. I used a method, if you like, called pedagogic mediation to guide what I did and to guide my role as a researcher. And as Helen told you at the beginning, my background is in teaching. I'm a teacher by trade. I'd worked in primary for quite some years, and I then moved over to work in children's centres across Birmingham. And I'd worked obviously with a whole range of early years practitioners in terms of that particular role that I held there. But I was particularly interested when I embarked on the doctoral research in how that would shift when I was no longer actually employed and working with these people as part of my my daily job. And it was much more about just finding out, having the time and space to find out about it. It was very much about participatory pedagogy, and participatory pedagogy and pedagogic mediation is very much influenced here by the work of Julia and João Formancino, who are based in Portugal. And I actually was very lucky in that I got to meet with them at a BICERA conference in Birmingham a few years ago, the British Early Childhood Research Association, and they guided me really. They're not part of my supervisory team, but they guided me in those early doctoral years, and enabled me to find out much more about pedagogic mediation, and to detail and to talk with me in detail about participatory pedagogy, which was certainly something I was striving for. So the slice of my research questions and sub-questions that's really relevant for this chapter and that helped me to frame the chapter looked at how practitioners were listening to the children in their care and whether or not this could be further developed and what else might be done about it. So drawing was one research tool that I explored with the practitioners that I was working with, and I worked just over 2 years actually, going into 3 early childhood settings that were all relatively different to one another, and I was going in on a weekly basis. So in terms of the amount of data that I was generating, that should give you an idea of how long I was engaging with my participants. And as I've said, drawing was just one of the ways that we tried to develop listening within the settings. So I'd previously studied Clark and Moss's Mosaic Approach as part of my master's that Helen mentioned at the beginning, and actually in the setting that I was working in at the time, and with my sort of team of practitioners, we trialled it and we'd actually had a go at the nuts and bolts of making it work as a daily tool for us in the setting, and it had its strengths, but equally there were some areas that it didn't work well for us, and naturally, as these things do, the team had adapted it to fit their own needs. So that's really around that reflexivity. I was really thinking about how I could develop it further. How would it work with people that I didn't know? How could it be rolled out on a much broader scale? How could we better listen to the children? So armed with that sort of background and having had that sort of history undertaking research, postgraduate research, I was working across these 3 settings with the practitioners. My goal, their goal, our goal was to better listen to the children that were in their care. And one of the ideas that I'd had, and I'd sort of unpicked all the different elements of the Mosaic Approach, and they talk about map making, and they use drawing, and they use the child conferences and so on and so forth. So I wanted to really unpick further what else we could get from drawing specifically as a method to elicit the opinions and the views of the children. So Anning and Ring's Making Sense of Children's Drawings was relatively a seminal discovery for me. And it really sort of spoke to me on a sort of a paradigm level in terms of helping me to understand how we could actually interpret the work that the children were doing. Also of sort of note and of influence to me, and certainly actually linked to the title of the book itself, Beyond the Conventional. Helen Carr has done an awful lot of work on creative research methods. She's relatively active actually on Twitter, and she's a real great advocate herself of creative and different research methods. So if you are thinking of going beyond the conventional yourself, I'd recommend having a little rummage in her work as well. So those were sort of inspirational really to me in those early sort of days, framing what the research was going to look like. For me, using drawing was to do with that paradigm and methodological choice. I knew that it would help me to interpret. I knew I was undertaking interpretivist research. I knew that engaging in the drawing alongside the children would enable for me and the practitioners to better understand and be able to interpret the children's views. And I very much felt that drawing really had a home and a place in early childhood research. It seemed appropriate for those children. One of the considerations and one of the difficulties really in terms of engaging in such research were the ethics of whether or not I was a practitioner researcher. I wasn't employed by any of the settings. I was voluntarily undertaking my research with them. We were doing it together. But I was very aware that the children saw me as an adult. They positioned me, I positioned myself, but they also positioned me. And I was constantly mindful that they were viewing me as an adult and therefore potentially somebody in power and authority in the setting. So I really needed to be careful to unpick the research the ethics behind this particular research method in terms of children's sort of natural compliance. Really trying to take note of their assent. Did they want to be engaging in this drawing opportunity at this particular time? I'm sure we've all worked alongside practitioners that are keen that every single child has a turn and everybody must come and sit at the table and undertake the activity and sort of be ticked off on the class list. So I found myself working against that mindset with some of my practitioners who were keen that I had a class list and make sure I talked to every child, tick, tick, tick. But equally, that the children didn't always necessarily see me as an authority figure, sort of prompting them that they must come and sit and participate or even finish. You know, it's like you haven't finished that drawing, you've got a bit of blank space over here, come and do a bit more. So I was very keen not to be in an authority role. And also it's worth mentioning in terms of early childhood, particularly within the English system, which is the one I'm able to speak about more freely. Early mark making is very much central in terms of drawing, early mark making, the road to literacy, if you know what I'm talking about. And children are encouraged in terms of their fine motor skills and holding their pencil and so on and so forth. And I didn't want the children engaging in drawing for the purposes of research to be, I thought it was quite a blurred line really in terms of the research outcomes and then the potential for them to be fulfilling educational outcomes, if you like, in relation to their skills with the pencil or the crayon. I made use, actually, I found the ESERA ethical guidelines helpful. They really specifically located my research in that early childhood field, and they enabled me to think about those issues of power that I was struggling with at times. In relation to the data, if you like, that my research gathered, drawing for me produced, if you like, data during the process of the drawing itself and then as an outcome. So I detail in the chapter very much the difference between the process of engaging in the drawing alongside the child and sitting with them while they express their views and opinions, and then also the data that can be gathered, if you like, from the outcome of a piece. What does this mean? How can we interpret this particular piece of, drawing? So it's important to note, I'm going to show you some images in a moment, but it is important to note that alongside all of the images, there are field notes that were taken in detail. Some of them were taken by me if I was sitting alongside an activity, but equally the practitioners that I was working alongside got very good at engaging in sort of annotating the backs and the sides and around and post-it notes so that we could get an interpretive voice alongside what the child was actually engaging in. So there's three ways that I had to go, basically, gave it a bit of a try. Three different ways that I used drawings. I used free drawings, and I used free drawings in all three of the settings that I was engaging in. So the free drawing in my particular research, basically, and those of you that have worked in early childhood will smile when I say it, this is your roll of wallpaper on the floor, and your variety of media and materials out there that they can then engage with you, and a bit of an open invitation. Really, what we were after was just an interpretation. What do you really enjoy about coming to nursery? What do you love about preschool? And some of the children used the opportunity to mark, make and draw while they talked to us and provided the answers orally to the questions that we talked about, and some of the children actually had a go at drawing a recreation of what they wanted to share with you. So we had a bit of a mixture of both. And there's two images that I wanted to share with you all today. Top left is quite a dark image, and it's a colour photograph that's been taken top left. So you can see that the child's elected only to use the dark black crayon, and that was all drawn very, very quickly, very rapidly, probably in less than 5 minutes. The child was clearly not particularly happy to be with us in setting that day, and they wanted to engage in the activity, and the message that this particular child wanted sharing was that Mommy and Daddy are not at preschool, and she was not particularly happy to be here today, and that was what she wanted to convey in terms of engaging in the process. Whereas the example on the right was a much longer exchange with a very, very chatty young lady who wanted to talk to me all about the puppet show and how she set it up, and the drawing was much larger than that, and it sort of talked through where she would make all of her friends sit in order to engage in the puppet show, and talked about what she liked about it, which was ultimately that she managed to get the attention of those around her to engage in an activity of her choice, and she got to choose the story that would then be told through the puppet show. So what the practitioners that engaged in this activity alongside me particularly found that it provided time and space that might not have been there if there had been an outcome focused activity that they were doing with the children. So just having an open-ended prompt and having that time for that engagement, and Elizabeth has just talked about loose parts, and I'd suggest the same is possible there. It just provided time and space to be able to engage in an unhurried way with the children around topics that were of interest to them and to the practitioners. So all of once we'd all done the free drawing, and all three of the settings, as I've said, that I worked with, all three of them had to go at that and spent time and space engaging in drawing alongside children, or sitting alongside children while they were drawing. And actually some of the children did ask at times the practitioners to pick up a crayon, a pencil or a paintbrush or whatever, and to engage themselves, which they did. And then the three settings all went off in their own sort of different ways, if you like, and it was participatory research, so it was very important that the practitioners themselves were the drivers of which methods we were actually having a go at. So one of the settings, in just one of the settings, the practitioners wanted to have a go at map making, and I'd talked to them about Clark and Moss's Mosaic Approach, and I'd talked to them about the conceptions of map making in that approach and the use of photography potentially, and how the children could then give setting tours and tours around the area. And it was actually the practitioners that took the idea. They were uncomfortable with using digital imagery in the setting, particularly uncomfortable, so that was fine. That was where they were at the time with it. And but they did encourage the children to draw their own maps, and the prompt that they were sort of playing with and using at the time was, what is it like to live here? What do you like about particularly living in this location? And they'd done quite a lot of work locally, sort of taking the children on walks around in small groups, visiting local playing fields and local parks and things like that. And there'd been a lot of general discussion about what it was like to live in this particular location. And they asked the children who were interested to respond. This is actually a picture of the local park, and it's a picture of the playground and the play equipment. And we can see the child is balancing on the stepping stones at the bottom and reaching up for the climbing equipment above their head. So that's kind of what's happening in that particular picture, and that was the explanation that went alongside that one. Okay, the third method that I tried, and again, this was just in one of my 3 settings. It was a different setting to the setting that I tried the map making. But again, so in this setting, we tried the free drawing. We'd used that. The practitioners had really enjoyed engaging and having the time and space with the children. And in this particular setting, one of the practitioners really pushed me. What else can we do? Come on, Helen. There's got to be something else that we can try. You get back to that university library and get in those books and come and bring us some more ideas. We want to do something else. And this setting had really played with photography. They'd used some of the Mosaic Approach ideas, if you like, around engaging children in photography to elicit their views, but they wanted more. So they'd undertaken a trip to a local zoo, and the practitioner was talking to me about how we can best really capture the children's experiences of how that day had gone for them, what they'd enjoyed. You know, they wanted to go to their sort of advisory board and ask to be able to take the children out more frequently. So what could we do to kind of really make sure that the children's voice was heard about this particular day that they'd had? So I'd read around Sarah Eldon's concentric circles of closeness, which have been used from slightly more potentially of a psychological point of view around mapping relationships based on who's closest to you right at the centre, and you know, who isn't particularly feeling quite as close to you, that you pop further around the outside of your concentric circles. And I just wondered about the nuances of using a graduated approach with much younger children. So in the research of Eldon's that I read, it was slightly older primary and secondary children that had used the concentric circles. But here in this particular setting, we were looking, yes, I was working particularly with the practitioners in the preschool area, but this was towards the end of an academic year. You know, children were transitioning from rooms to spaces to here to there. So actually there were some children as part of this group that were yet to turn 3. And they also engaged in this activity. And I have to hand on heart say I was very sceptical when the practitioner said, I explained Eldon's concentric circles, the practitioner said, yes, definitely, that's what I want to try, let's do that, let's get it all ready. I was a bit sceptical about how the children would be able to engage in a nuanced, graduated response that also relied on their drawing. And you can see my concerns were completely unfounded. The practitioner decided, and she sort of helped to sort of sort out, obviously all the children were very enthusiastic, everybody wanted to have a go. We were watching all the time, obviously, for that level of assent, but the practitioner, I have to say, made a calculated choice, and she invited one of the more able children to come and sit and have a go first, who grasped the activity very, very quickly and put their most favourite part of the day right in the centre, and knew that only one, perhaps maybe two things could go right in the middle, and then what else had they enjoyed that went immediately around the outside. And then I'm not sure if you can quite see it on the PowerPoint, but up to the right, this particular child had explained this is where you can put the things that you don't like, but they went on to explain there wasn't anything about their day that they didn't like at all, so they left that section completely blank. Equally, I don't know if you can see, but there's clearly a piece of paper covering a child's name on the right. This was a child that knew their own mind, and I'd asked if it would be okay, because we will be using this. Is it okay if we use the work? Yes, it's okay that we use the work. So is it okay if we put our names on the back? No, said this child, I want my name on the front because it's mine. But there we go, consent and ethics as they are, we've had to cover it over, but the child was very, very clear that that's what they wanted it on the front on that particular one. The same on the left. You can see what the child particularly liked, talking about the giraffe right in the middle, some of the other animals, apples and things. Interestingly, on this one, the what held the child back in the example on the left was their own conceptions that they were not able to draw. I'm not a good drawer. I don't know how to draw these things. I can't draw that. And they insisted on encouraging the practitioner that they were sitting alongside to draw some of those representations, or to, you know, do them for them here and there. And it was quite a challenge, really, to try and encourage them to draw. So the challenge with the activity wasn't that the children didn't understand the nuanced approach to gaining their views. It was actually that they already, some at not yet 3 years of age, had got quite a definite view about their own drawing skills and experience, and particularly interesting that they weren't very keen on walking everywhere. I believe it was quite hilly and there were lots of steps made on that particular day. So the practitioners that engaged in this particular activity have continued to use it. They used it to evaluate their garden space, and they asked the children to collaborate together on an example of what they particularly liked and didn't like about their garden space. They also had a few different tries of different number of circles to see if it made much of a difference how many they put in. Broadly speaking, the children were very, very competent and completely understood. Favourite things go in the middle, least favourite things were going around the outside. So it was it worked for us in the context that we were using it. In terms of the strengths and limitations of drawing on the whole as a written method, you'll see I've put exactly the same thing at the top. It's a strength where it works, but equally you do need to remember that it's a limitation as well, as many of these things are. Children already have such a fixed view of themselves and their skills in relation to art, and whether or not they can draw, and that was quite challenging with using drawing, and they encouraged the practitioners to engage alongside them in the drawing, and exactly that actually applies to the practitioners as well. Some of the practitioners were reluctant to engage in the draw methods and would articulate to the children, oh, but I'm no good, I can't draw either, and it was kind of perpetuating that we don't want to draw message, which wasn't always wonderfully helpful when that was the method you were trying to use. It is developmentally appropriate. Children can and should be able to access drawing at a level that's right for them, and it fits really, really naturally within practitioner research. It fits really readily and easily within early years. It gave us bags of room to talk. I've noticed sort of some of the discussion in the chat and links back to a talk that Alison Clark's given us some research that she's doing around slow pedagogy, and it absolutely gave them time and space, and it was unhurried for them when it happened, and I think that was a strength of the method in itself, and it absolutely encouraged the children's voice. It tuned in, it enabled the practitioners to tune in and be on the children's frequency for a while, and not particularly be worrying about where we were moving on to next and what activity was coming next, or whether it needed to be assessed, or whether it needed to be triple mounted and stapled on the wall, or anything like that. So it enabled voice through space. In terms of some of the limitations, some of the other limitations, it did create, you can imagine, quite a lot of data. If you can imagine myself working in a participatory way with practitioners in 3 settings, so generating data in 3 sort of places and spaces over quite a prolonged period of time, it's quite a lot. So it is mindful to kind of have your end date and your exit in mind. That's something as a researcher that I'm still learning even now. What's difficult is who decides which children can participate. This is something that I've got a real bee in my bonnet about, for want of a better expression, in that if you're going to engage in research with these children, it needs to be open to all of the children that are in the setting, because by including just a few, you marginalise other children, you exclude other children. So with consent, I absolutely appreciate that is a real issue and a real point of tension. But I think engaging in activities in the public nature, if you like, of an early year setting, where all can see, it's important that everybody has the opportunity to engage if they would like to. Participatory interpretation, I've put, requires time and space. It wasn't just that we did the drawings and then popped them in a drawer. The drawings were very much process-oriented drawings. They took place over time, and they came with a narrative that went next to them, just about who was saying what and how conversation was kind of evolving, not verbatim, just broadly sort of following the gist of what was happening as it evolved. But equally then, if the drawing was a finished outcome, it needed to be given back to its owner, and the interpretation of it needed to be checked. So I mean, I personally draw a lot on the work of Goober and Lincoln, and consider trustworthiness to be particularly important, and Shenton does a great article breaking down trustworthiness in that particular way, and actually giving it back and double checking that your interpretation of the drawing is accurate is a really, really important consideration, and that particularly takes an awful lot of time. So for as long as it takes just to generate the data in the first instance, checking that you've actually got the data right is a whole other chunk of time to follow. Now, as I've said, the drawn methods, which are written about in our lovely book, are just a slice of the research that I undertook. So there's 2 other spaces and places if you wanted to find out a little bit more, or the third is dropping me an email. But I have managed to write a peer-reviewed journal article that focuses on the participatory nature of the research. The slice I take for that particular article is just on one setting. I just look at it from one setting's perspective, and then also in terms of Mike Gasper and Rosie Walker's book on mentoring and coaching, I've looked particularly at pedagogic mediation, so how I worked alongside the practitioners and how I allowed my role to develop with the practitioners. I wrote about that in that particular book there, so you can find out more if you'd like to, or you're very welcome to chat or get in touch later by email. And thank you all very much for your time.
Oh, Helen, thank you so much. The chat has gone mad. Oh, I've got a bit of an echo there. I don't know whether that's me or why I've got an echo. That's okay. So let us begin. Lots of thanks, obviously, to begin with. A bit of a fan club for Angela Anning going on there. Lots of people recognising her contributions and having been taught by her as well, which is just brilliant. A gold star for you for publishing while doing your PhD. Some of us still haven't done that. And but really, everybody picking up on this idea, first of all, that idea that about restricting the actions and challenging and pushing back practitioners' expectations of what what can be done and how it can be done. I thought that was really very forceful coming through in the chats here, in the questions. Lots of positive comments about valuing and responding to children's voices and the importance of respectfully listening to, sorry, my dog's barking now, respectfully listening to those voices, and writ large, of course, all the way through is this idea of time and space, which is absolutely crucial. And I think for me, I think it's interesting in terms of they managed to make time and space to do this. Why don't they do it all the time? Was there any sort of response to that?
Well, I think, if I'm honest, Helen, I think that's where the pedagogic mediation element of my study came in. It was it's very easy, having been there and having been that practitioner in that busy early years setting, it is very easy to kind of get your head down, get your blinkers on, and just charge merrily forth with what you feel you've been instructed to do. I do really sincerely believe that as a sector we lack professional acknowledgement and a really broad sense, and I'm not suggesting that we lack professionalism at all. We are an incredibly professional workforce, but I think we lack the recognition that should go alongside that. And I think as a sector we often feel a little downtrodden, if I'm honest, and we don't feel that we can necessarily shout up. One of the main messages that's come out of the end of my thesis is I went into it looking to listen to children, and I've come out of it thinking, yes, I'm still there. I still need to listen to children, but you know what? We need to listen to the practitioners as well, because you know, it works both ways. It's something called it's isomorphism. It's pedagogic isomorphism. The relationships are all linked together, and it's just about the whole, isn't it? It's about making sure if we're going to treat the children in this way and give them time and space and listen to them, do you know what? We're going to have to do exactly the same with the practitioners and give time and space to them. And I felt that being in that space with them, I was able to listen to their ideas. All of the drawings and all of the methods that we did engage in happened because the practitioners wanted to do it. It didn't happen because I turned up and said, I'm the expert, I'm the researcher, let's do this. I mean, I had to turn up with some ideas. I couldn't turn up with nothing at all. But, you know, so the free drawing was my way in, and it was the first thing we did in all the settings. But all of the settings following that went down their own path because it was participatory research, and the practitioners decided where they wanted to take it next. And it was in the one setting where the practitioners were, the challenge that they brought to me was fabulous, absolutely fabulous. Come on, what next, Helen? We've done this, we've done that. Yeah, what we're going to try now? And I joked a little, and about the exiting, but I've been terrible at exiting because you build up such relationships, and it was in the time and space of those relationships that I would say, but why are you doing it like that? Why are you writing your planning down in 4 places? You know. Yeah. What's the value of that for the child or for you as a practitioner? And it was, I think, engaging in the research enabled them to have the time and space. And I would hope, and I am actually still in touch with them because I'm rubbish at exiting, as we all know. I know that there are some elements that they've been able to hang on to, but it's amazing how quickly the next policy rollout can make them feel overwhelmed.
They don't know what they're doing again. And it's that idea of trust, isn't it? And it is back to that professionalism. You know, you're right that the practitioners in general, you know, they all behave professionally, but actually that trust in their understanding of pedagogical approaches to children's learning, it just disappears. And that, you know, we go back to this sort of tick box, got to do this, got to do that, got to evidence, whatever. So I think you've got everybody. There's a lot of nodding going on. I think Microsoft need to invent an emoji for let's get nodding.
Nodding.
A couple of other things about this idea of, you know, listening to really listening to the children. That idea of checking back. I remember that. I'm going to indulge myself here, listening to you present your master's research, and I've quoted it often to my students when you were talking about the children playing in the pirate ship. They'd taken a picture in the pirate ship and the assumption was that they liked being in the pirate ship. When actually, when you spoke to them, what they said was, well, it's a place where we can sit and have a chat and the adults can't see us. And it was that idea of, you know, that agency of the children taking, but we'd made assumptions about what could have made assumptions about what they were doing there. Helen, you've absolutely set everybody on fire. People want notes. Let's have a look. There's people saying it's inspiring, wonderful to be part of this seminar, which is fantastic. People are sharing reading, which is brilliant. There was a very specific question about ages, what age you think you can do this this kind of research with.
Well, the youngest children were, I engaged with all of the children that were in these settings, and one of my 3 settings had babies, so I made a point of spending time and space in their room as well, because I didn't want to exclude their voices from the research, and their practitioners as well. So I spent time listening, or trying to focus on listening across the breadth of early years. But I would say it was 2-year-olds that were actually actively engaging in the drawing, most definitely. And I did have my doubts about the extent to which they would be able to engage, but I was absolutely proved completely incorrect.
And isn't that where we always are, this assumption that we know and we don't know? Children will always surprise us if we provide the right environment for them to work in. There was one other question. Did you ask the children to draw themselves or any loved ones, or was it always about places and environment?
No, the space we were inquiring about their experiences, really, of being in the setting. I think what is relevant in terms of drawing themselves and others is actually on the big sheet roll of paper. One of the reasons that I couldn't bring those images just is in terms of identifying children, because when you listen to them, you do have to listen to them. So when they say to you, no, you'll write my friend's name down there, then you'll write it down, thus making it very difficult to share in a public forum. Yeah. But the children do focus on relationships. Clark and Moss found that originally with the Mosaic approach, in terms of children will report back more on relationships than they will on actual activities that they engage in. And I found exactly the same, both in the MA research and this. So both the drawings and the photographs that were taken in the one setting that engaged in photo elicitation, it was photos of friends and children, and it was basically lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of the same child and the same image, and each other. So relationships definitely does come through this particular method. We didn't specifically ask them to draw themselves or others, but that came through as the response. What do you enjoy being here?
Oh, thank you, Helen. You need to go through the chat because you'll be so inspired, and so really people have absolutely loved hearing all about your research and all about your methodology, and we thank you for putting it into the book. So yeah, I think you're going to have lots of people arriving at CREC at the Learning Circle to find out more. We're going to take a break now because we've finished with sort of listening about children and research in early childhood, and we're going to move on to how we research with adults. So we're going to have a little stretch, little comfort break, stretch your legs, and we'll be back. Is it 3 o'clock?
3, yeah, but please stay on the link. So just
yes,
keep muted and your cameras off, but stay on the link.
Okay, lovely. Thank you, Zita. Thank you, everyone. Hello. Some lovely comments, aren't they? Going really well.
It's great.
Excellent. Joe's got a coffee ready to go. It's a shame, isn't it? The thing is that this is the dilemma between the online stuff and face-to-face, because if it's face-to-face, you book the time, you protect the time. Whereas when it's online, maybe you go to more, maybe that's a thing, but time is not so easy to protect.
I am wondering whether it might be possible if we could organise a part 2 with some of the contributors that weren't able to come.
Yeah.
Because it's been so well received that maybe we could look at that, because there's only so much online. You can't, you can only do this for a couple of hours, can't you, really? Whereas we could potentially look at, oh yeah, that's great. Those are comments. Yeah, we could look at the other contributors and see if we could organise another one in a few months' time, maybe.
Yeah, definitely. I think so. That's what we've done with the Early Childhood Studies Degrees Network Conference. We usually have a whole day event, and we've put it into 3. We put it into 2, but we had so many requests for contributions that we've had to put it into 3. So,
yeah.
But it's too long, a whole day is just too much.
Definitely. Okay, so shall we start?
Yep.
Okay, so I get to introduce Helen. So Helen Perkins is my co-editor for this book and a senior lecturer in early childhood studies. She's going to talk to us today about the use of identity boxes as a research method. Thank you, Helen.
Hopefully, if we can just get the screen sorted. Okay, hopefully this is the slideshow from the beginning. Okay, can you see that, Zita? Is that okay?
Yes.
Lovely, thank you. Okay, well, thank you very much. I've been inspired by the first half of our seminar and listening to people talking about their research with children and all the challenges that presents. But equally, when we're working with adults as well, we have to think about the similar aspect, all the same aspects about those ethics, about preparation, about how we're going to do it, how it's all going to work. So I'm going to talk to you today about the use of identity boxes as a research method. This is my chapter from the book. And what I aim to do is to examine the efficacy of the boxes as a methodological tool, and then discuss some of the strengths and the challenges of using those methods in our research. So it's drawn from the idea of, and the presentation today and the chapter is drawn from 2 projects which I worked on. One with a colleague, Alex Kendall, who is now was a Wolverhampton person, then went to BCU. And the first project was listening to old wives' tales, small stories. It was about the roots of a career and then the remaking and retelling of research. And the second one is my doctoral research from training to qualification, looking at level 3 students' experience. So 2 different types of students there, I guess, too. So adult learners who are in the workplace, and then students who are 16 to 18, just finishing off their early years qualifications at college. And I wanted to do, there are a couple of things really that we wanted to do differently. I wanted to make it a bit more interesting, but we were teaching the research methods for the foundation degree students, and we had a conversation about how we could do that a little bit differently. Maybe we could teach them about research by doing research with them. And in the conversation with Alex, she'd brought up this idea of using identity boxes. She brought this quote to my attention. This is from Clark Keith, and saying, often I can see it before I can say it, and I can sense it before I can make sense of it linguistically. And that struck a chord with me really, because it started me thinking about how, a bit like Helen was saying with the children, we don't give time and space. Often we'll send out a questionnaire, we'll do an interview, but actually people need time and space to think about their answers. So what's an identity? An identity box is really, or a story box, like any craft-based creation. So there's very much links to the previous presentations that you've had. boxes are constructed by the participants, and it acts then as a provocation for facilitating the reflexive process. These are all the words from session 1 for Jackie's reflexive practice session as well. So it supports that reflexive process, that deep reflection, thinking about the what and the why and how we think about things. It enables us to think critically about our experiences, about the values, about our actions, whatever it is that we want to focus on in terms of the research. And often, and I think these were some of the questions that came up in the chat earlier, that stories from the past can often be connected to objects, and the object then is the thing that evokes the memories. And so what we're doing in this research, we're using this methodology, enables that time for that reflexivity to produce the rich data. And it's then in contrast to that direct questioning approach. I didn't put this on the slide, but one of my favourite quotes that I think I put it in the book, I'm not sure, is was from Gauntlet, who said most people don't respond well to a sociologist with a clipboard. And I think that says a lot about how we approach research and the value of using these creative methods that provides that time and space that Helen was talking about. So we began by reading Cathy Nutt Brown's paper, A Box of Childhood, Small Stories at the Roots of a Career. And if you haven't read it, it's a good read, it's worth a read. Cathy bought a box, like you can see here. In fact, she tried several different ones, so choosing the objects were really important. And she selected 9 objects that told the story of her career into where she is now professor in early childhood. And so it's that idea of using Cathy's ideas, this idea of choosing objects, selecting things, that led us to using identity boxes, using a creative method. So we introduced the idea to the students, this was to the foundation degree students in that first project, about learning about research could be experiential, and it could be structured around a piece of collaborative research, so that we would look at their journeys into becoming graduates in the early years workforce, but we would also use that experience to teach them the research methods module, to teach them about research and what it was like to be the subjects of the research themselves. And so it became an autoethnographical study with that empirical material. And what we hoped was that we would produce some really detailed narratives about their journey, but also reflect on what it's like to participate in research. Here are some of the pictures. I smile when I see them, I have to say. They bring back so many memories of the students that went through this process. Some of them I'm still in touch with, which is lovely. So the boxes really were the metaphors that came through. They created their boxes, they put it all together individually and independently, and then everybody sat around and told their story. They talked us through their box, and it facilitated that conversation really. And if you look at some of them here, you know some of the metaphors that were in the boxes. There were brick walls, which represented barriers that students had to overcome. For example, Donna, one of the students, used scales here to show the struggle that she had balancing her family. There's her little family down there. Her family, her work. As foundation degree students, they're all employed in early years settings, in private daycare settings. So long days, quite intense. So her family, her work, her life, her studying. And so that's how she represented it here. And obviously talking us through it, she talked about what some of those challenges were and how they'd manifested or impacted on her life and on her study and on her work. Students acknowledged the importance of that family support, having somebody there in the background. And one of the students talked about being a role model for her grandchildren. And while expressing her amazement at being on the foundation degree at all, she added that she would definitely not be going any further and wasn't going to complete her didn't want to go on to the top up. She felt she'd reached her limit academically. And she personally then wanted to reclaim her place within the family. I think that it gave us an opportunity to explore that. Once she'd finished telling her story, that we were able to explore that in a little more depth and think about what the impact really had been and whether it was worth it. Got here this is a staircase, and it's hard to tell from the picture, but at the top there is a mortarboard. So this is a student on this very, very steep staircase, hemmed in by these very dark and high walls, but striving to get to graduation, absolutely determined to complete. And I think when we think about using a method like this, what we're finding is that if you ask the question, tell us about why you're on the foundation degree, or tell us what it's been like, a bit like somebody was asking Helen Linden about that, what's it like? Actually, by using the creativity approach, this method, giving that time and space for thought and for reflection, ended up with some really, really rich data. And as I said, we were using this for two aspects. One, to write the paper about the foundation degree students and their journey and their experience and what the value of it was, but also to teach them, to take an innovative approach to teaching about research methods, rather than going through, as we all do. This week we're going to talk about questionnaires or literature reviews or methodologies or whatever. We taught them about it through the experience. And here are some of the things, the key things that they talked about, and I think they're really valuable for us all to remember when we're doing research. But by having it as a live experience, they were surprised at sometimes the intimate nature of the stories that they were told. And they found the experience of listening to others quite humbling, and they felt that they were more attuned to the complexities of those ethical issues. They developed these new sensitivities towards potential participants, that you can't just jump in, people don't have to participate. And when they do participate, people are investing in you and in what they're saying, and the importance of valuing that. The ethics really for them, rather than being ethical issues, the ethics had come alive. It was more than a process now. It was about people. It was about people, and it was about their lives, and it was invasive, but it was important, and it had power. They discovered that it was emotive, and that researchers really have a responsibility towards their participants to exercise that duty of care. That bit at the bottom of the ethics form that we just go, oh yes, I'll make sure we've got counselling available, or there'll be a link to a website. They really took that much more seriously by having this experience. And they talked about the notion of representations being one of the crucial ones for the researchers, that making it and doing enabled the stories to be shared without just words. And the complexity of their responses really was suggesting that research isn't just this surface activity, it isn't just something to be done. They fed back that they felt that the use of those symbolic artifacts really enriched and enhanced the data, and we felt that too. I don't think we'd have got this if we'd have, as we say, go with the clipboard and ask some questions. But the process had taught them the importance of honouring and respecting the participants, and that the work had allowed them to focus on the small and individual stories, to recognise their differences as well as the things that resonated, that brought them together. So that idea that being able to take the time to reflect, to create the box, to retell the story, provided that moment of nuanced reflection, things that perhaps they'd forgotten, things that they'd forgotten about. So they had this sensitivity towards that intimate nature of data, and recognising that it isn't objective. Jackie's talked about that, in fact everybody's talked about that, and that it's distinct from the lived lives. It's not separate from life, but it's very much entangled with people's experiences, and it's not cold and objective, but it is embedded in reality and in people's real life experiences. One of the unexpected outcomes about taking this approach was interesting for us as researchers, in terms of, and for the students as scholars. They talked about the idea that it raised the questions about the relationship between issues of accessibility and credibility in terms of academia. Some students found themselves instinctively questioning the legitimacy of a process that felt very accessible and very meaningful. And they thought, surely research and scholarship should feel really difficult. It's very academic, it should be alien. But actually, it was very accessible, and it was very, they understood it, and they were able to experience it. So it opened that really interesting debate about the nature of a scholarship, really. And perhaps it certainly made Alex and I think that maybe there was another paper in there that we didn't get around to writing another one. We all moved on and said, oh, you know where life takes you in different directions. So really, as you can see from that one experience, by using the creative method, produced lots and lots of rich data, because we created the boxes. That was the first stage. They talked through their stories, the second stage. We then talked about their stories, which was the third stage. And then we talked about the process of research. So it was really fascinating and really enriching, and it still resonates with me today. I think, you know, when reflecting on identity boxes as a research tool, the students agreed that this idea of using the artifacts enriched the stories and helped develop the narrative. So, flushed with the success of that one, when it came to my doctoral research, I was very keen to use a similar approach. And from in this, it was from training to qualification, looking at the journey of those level 3 student practitioners. So in the foundation degree, they were adult learners, mature learners who were working, all were over 24, a couple over 25, I think. Many of them much older than that, many of them in their 40s. And so a different student group altogether. And I had not really given great consideration to how that might differ and what the impact that might be about using it with different people. However, we went about it. It was one element of my doctoral research. I did start with a large-scale questionnaire. I then went through into interviews and then into the focus group where we used the identity boxes. So it was participants who were about to as they complete their course. Interestingly, when the students, they were quite keen to participate, they enjoyed it. But what I found was the stories for the younger students, for the level 3 students, I felt the responses were shorter, the stories were shorter, they were less reflective. And I considered, is this a failing on my part really, by not probing more deeply? Or is it the case that reflexivity or reflectivity and reflexivity that Jackie talked about earlier on, is it a skill that requires maturity? I'm reflecting about, you know, I talked about earlier about the cohesion and the maturity of the foundation degree. Perhaps the age and experience of this younger group was a factor. So I'm going to share a couple of the images and then see where we went with it. So here we had this, and I said, you know, these are short stories, and it's, you know, my box is like a road. It starts when I was at school and I used to look after the other children in the younger years. I always used to try and help solve problems that they had in the playground. And then I went to college, and then I did all my work and I got lots of experience like the work placement, and I just became to love it even more. And as you go through the road, there's lots of clouds and a big question mark at the end, because I don't know what the future is going to be. So some quite interesting comments. But when we had the conversation about it, it didn't go much deeper and much further. Another example here. I went from having a little knowledge to having a lot of knowledge, and now I'm going to work and that's it. So it was quite brief. When we delved a bit further, she said, well, you know, when I went to school, I used to like helping the other children, a bit like the first one. And then I did my level 2 and I did my level 3, and now this is where I am. And so again, not much thought about how we got here, why we got here, why they think what they did. And you know, you start to question, is it me? Is it the way that I've put the stories together? Is it the way I set up the task? I wasn't sure that I'd done it particularly any differently to the first time. But here we go. So here's another. Now this one is a different one. Yeah, these 3 images are from the same box, but it's quite hard to see when they're making them in there. You know, the paper boxes that you have for the printer paper, so they're quite deep boxes. I hadn't considered that, so maybe that's a consideration if you choose to use this approach at any time. So this is Lee. She's been a student with us since she joined us in level 1 at 16, so straight from school, no GCSEs, a whole heap of personal issues. Including ADHD and autism, which hadn't been diagnosed at school. And actually her box almost tells the story of that diagnosis and how she came to terms with it. Before we sound really sad about it, I'd just like to say that she managed to get GCSE, English, Maths and Science, all grade C or above. She went on to the foundation degree and then on to a top-up, and she's got a 2-1 and employed in a placement, and they love her. But the journey, boy, that was a journey. Her story took me by surprise, and it's something perhaps, you know, like I keep saying, I'm going to follow it up really, because it's the importance of working in that affective domain. So this is my box, and it starts off on level 1, where I was really angry, and Helen's office was like this really big space because I was there often. She smiled. And this says the line on the thing going around the string up and down the box. It goes up and down on level 1, and it goes up when I was in level 2. It would go up, and then it was going down. But Helen's office got smaller each time, and I had less of the ups and less of the downs. And then I got on to level 3, and Helen's office is all good. It's small because things are good. And so by this time we'd got her diagnosis, we'd got strategies, we'd got support, and she was understanding. Having had the diagnosis, you know, explaining her behaviour, she understood it. She's a smart student, and she understood it. So she said, so it all goes down, but not too much. And there it is. So hopefully I'll get to the goal at the end, when it's all even and halfway down. So there was no ups and downs, that she was managing to access her learning and to really enjoy being in college. I'd not appreciated the impact on her of being called to my office. And she'd reflected on how angry she was about being there often, and the journey was full of these highs and lows. But she came to, the more she appreciated and understood who she is, her understanding of being in my office changed, in terms of, rather than it being a place of discipline, it became a place to fear. It became a non-judgmental space for her to reflect and to prepare to go back into the learning environment. We had an open door. If she was not coping in class, she would just come, sit down. We wouldn't chat necessarily. I'd just work at the desk, and she'd get on with it. And so all of this came out as a result of creating this box. So that for me was really powerful, and I started to think, well, okay, maybe I haven't messed it up. Maybe it just, some students are better at this, you know, have really got to grips with the idea. And this one made me laugh too. And you won't be surprised. This is blood, supposedly. She said, my box is basically me sitting in the corner at home. And actually, if I read it like Amelia did it, it's like, I'm sitting in the corner at home, crying over work because of being at work, and I'm all confused. And when I was on level 2, I was told I couldn't do level 3, and then I was really upset. And then I got put on level 3, and then I was really confused with all the new stuff. So I'd never done theories before, and it'd all been chucked at me. And then the blood on the wall, well, that's the blood on the wall and on my hands because of all the writing. And I've got a headband on because I was sweating. I sweat out puddles of it, and then there were puddles of crying. My laptop's on fire because of how much it's been used. And the star, well, at the end of the year, I got Student of the Year, and then I got employed. So that's brilliant. And again, clearly for Amelia, this studying was stressful, and yet I would never have known it. She was a model student, as we would, hope for. Excellent attendance, brilliant timekeeping, good in placement, well organised, all her coursework was completed to a good standard all the time. And yet listening to her articulate this journey with such emotion and expression and intonation and the body language, I didn't know. Well, I know now that this is the result of all her blood, sweat and tears. So I guess what I'm saying here is, we had a conversation afterwards about, now she was in, I did an follow-up interview with her, and she was talking about a bit more about how the process of undertaking her qualifications hadn't really prepared her sufficiently well, and that she had this big smack in the face when she first started. But actually, without the qualification, without going through that journey, that she wouldn't have been ready for the work. So, what's the point? What is the point of using this approach? What's the point? And what's good about it? There are, like all research methods, there are limitations. So really, there are lots more examples of the stories in my thesis, should you have, several hours to spend and have nothing better to do with your time. But really, I just wanted to share the contributions of the people that participated in this. There are the limitations as we're set using both projects. The strengths really, an identity box, like all the other methods you've heard about today, is really a process that acts as a catalyst for that deep reflection. And it helps you collect data in a way that appears to lead to a more relaxed atmosphere, puts participants at ease, and it produces rich, very contextualized data, including participants' feelings, moods, relationships. They've been mentioned before about that relationship between researcher and participant, and that's strengthened. And the creative approach can appear non-threatening, but not always. And the process values its participants as individuals, as not just as data. But there are, of course, limitations. And the method takes time to plan and prepare. And you need resources, you need space, you need time. And time can be a challenge because also once you've set the task in motion, if you then put a time limit on it, you can limit the depth of reflection and the creativity. So that can affect the quality of your data. Another potential limitation is that the identity boxes could be interpreted differently by the researcher. Helen was talking about that member checking, going back to the children, checking what you'd said or how you've interpreted what they said is what they meant. And so that you've got to have time and opportunity to do that. You've got to give people space to explain their creations, and some will take 5 minutes and some will take 15 minutes and some may take half an hour. So you've got to be ready to be flexible. So setting the task, really important that you've sort of, you can set it as you think you're going to set it, but the participants will make what they want to make out of it. They'll interpret it differently as well. Participants have to want to engage in this kind of approach. You can't just do it with everybody. You've got to know your people. You've got, being in early childhood, give them a bit of glitter and a glue stick and most people, will engage, but it's not right for everybody or every group. Participants and researchers must be mindful and respectful, and because intimate and personal stories are being shared. And so it's really important, having asked your question, to respectfully listen and to respectfully respond to that. And there's that responsibility of responding appropriately to any kind of emotive content that might appear. One of the other things that may come up is some of the stories involve other people, and then you've got that ethical issue about, can you include that? How do you include that? Is there a way of including it, or do you need to exclude it? So lots of things to think about. But I wanted to think on, finish really on this last picture. This is the students getting started, and here we've got typical early childhood studies, college-based provision. We've got a big trolley full of all of the creative stuff. The room is a mess, and they're all chatting and they're picking their resources here. But what happened afterwards, they went back to their tables to start creating, and then one by one they came back, put back certain stuff and took other things. And that was when I knew, and it happened in both projects, that's when I knew that that reflexive process was starting, because it mattered what they used, it mattered how they put it together. It wouldn't just do to have any old colour or any old shape or size of something. They knew what they wanted and how to do it. So what I would say is, what makes identity boxes an effective research instrument really is that it gives time and space for your participants to think, to reflect, to construct and reconstruct their stories. And like all research, while their stories are not necessarily truthful, it's their representation of their truth and their understanding of whatever concept or experience it is. So I think it's an effective means of facilitating greater understanding of the conceptualizations of people's participants' experience. And it's a valuable research tool. There we go, that is the end, I think. Yes. What I have to do now is work out how to stop sharing. Have I stopped sharing it, Zita?
No,
Yes.
It's still on at the moment.
Is it on? Oh yeah, okay, there we go.
There are so many comments.
Oh, good. That's nice.
I can't keep up with all of them, but there's some really interesting ones at the very beginning. Joe said sense making as a research approach, and was commenting on the thing power again. Alison said about using storyboarding as a research method. Somebody else said about the importance of like general questions like tell us about what it is like, the importance of having those kind of questions that open up for participants to respond in whatever way is right for them. loads of people commented on how much they loved the images of the identity boxes. And Joe
still got some of them.
Oh wow! Joe commented again on these objects are drenched in meaning, aren't they, for those students? It's so lovely.
Yeah, absolutely. I've actually done it with because we don't all have a craft trolley. I had a big cupboard full of craft stuff at college, but I've done it with Lego and Duplo, and it works equally as well. And in the same way, and you still get that, right, I want all the bricks, but then I don't want these ones, I want that specific one, and they'll go to different places to get exactly the right thing to represent what they want to say. It's fascinating. That 5-minute point is lovely, that silence, because you know they're in it. That
kind of relates to one of the questions, actually. It'd be interesting to hear your experience of it. But Nicola's written, I wonder whether any students might find making less accessible than reading or writing. Sorry, the comments are coming up, so I can't see the comment. I'm thinking back to Helen Linden's comments about our perceptions of ourselves as artists or not. Are some people intimidated by the task of making, and does this perhaps limit what they try to communicate through their boxes?
Yeah. Absolutely, it does, and I think that's why having that second stage is really important, to have the opportunity to talk it through, and to be that it's okay that they're not perfect. And in fact, when we did the first project, we showed them images of previous ones that were done in a different situation, and some of them were really scrappy, and some of them, so that pressure to present something perfect is not there, one hopes. But again, and that is about knowing your students, it's about knowing your participants. That relationship is important. I couldn't come and do it with a group of strangers, because they have to trust that you're not going to make fun of what they're doing, or that the people in the group are not going to make fun of what they're doing or be judgmental. So it's a really fine balance to get that right.
That's really interesting. Some of the comments were talking as well about, so Hannah said different methods work for different researchers, but also for different participants too. So it's interesting, and like you say, you need to know your participants.
Yeah. And it's that nuance, but the idea, and that's why it was so important with the foundation degree students, with that first group that we did it with, that we were teaching them about what it's like to research. We were teaching their research methods module by researching on them, with them. And that just made it so powerful for them to realise that you can't just jump in and do, you can't just jump in and do research with people. It takes time and investment, and you have to build that relationship, and you have to get to know people and to really understand people. It's very disrespectful to just turn up and expect to get some good data.
There are some comments as well, Helen, about whether it would be beneficial to use the identity boxes as like a longitudinal study. So whether to go back, and what's your thoughts on that?
Well, yes and no, because what I didn't share was part 2 of the foundation degree research. We did the identity boxes week 1, and the second week we asked them to bring in an artifact that represented them, that represented their journey. So they told the story, but something that just sort of encapsulated who they are. And the second week, it was so much more, it felt more constrained, and it felt more contrived. It felt like there was pressure to shine, to do something amazing, to be, to outdo perhaps others. And so revisiting, I'm not sure how that would work. We did think about, I have thought about doing that with the identity boxes. And I know a colleague at Solihull did that as well, because they used it for their professional development module, and they revisited them. So maybe it depends how you set it up, I guess. But there will be differences, because the idea, I think there's that element of surprise. I think they surprised themselves the first time when they did it as to how much they were able to tell, which they wouldn't have just told if you'd have asked them the question. So I think the second time, I'm not sure.
Do you think it would be beneficial to go back to them, for them to talk again about the identity box that they'd created instead then? So instead to go back and do more data collection with them, but returning to the box that they originally created?
Oh yeah, I think so. It depends, because some of them are still with us. I don't mean still with us, but some we're still in contact with. But obviously, I'm talking a few years ago now with that project. but still in touch with a couple, so maybe I could do that. I think it's not a bad idea. Thank you.
Oh, thanks so much, Helen. Could you, there are so many more comments that I've missed, so could you go through them if that's okay?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everybody. That's really kind. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Helen. I think you're introducing me now.
Okay. Well, then I'd better get my act together. I was so full of what I was doing. Okay, so it is my great pleasure to introduce the lady sitting before you, Dr. Zita Williams-Brown, a reader in educational and social justice at the University of Wolverhampton and leader of the Children and Young People Families Research Cluster. So we're really focusing on early childhood and just social justice. And she works within the University's Education Observatory and as exclusive executive member and chair of the British Educational Studies Association, BESA. Research predominantly, I've got no worms now, focuses on agendas and policies in early and primary education. And Zita has become a bit of an expert in Q methodologies, something I'd not heard about until she wrote this chapter for the book, and it's fascinating. So over to you, Zita. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen. Thank you. Can you see my slides properly? Have I put them up properly?
Yeah.
Okay. So I have to apologise in advance because I do like to use old-fashioned notes, so I have my notes by the side of me. So I'm presenting on behalf of myself and my co-author for this chapter, Gavin Rhodes. And as Helen said, those of you who know me know I'm a little obsessed with Q methodology. It's a little bit different to everything else we've talked about today. And I do always have a little panic when I try to present on this particular subject in a 20-minute presentation, because I normally run an hour-long Q methodology, like beginning introduction workshop for our university's research policy unit, and even that I can't cover everything in. So I do always have just a little mini panic beforehand about how and what to include in a smaller presentation. So please bear with me. So as Helen said, in the book we were keen to make sure that we also included research methods that are that can be used with practitioners as well. And from my perspective, Q methodology is a great methodology to use with practitioners, and it can be used with children. I have used it with children age primary age and above, but I don't think it's necessarily as accessible for younger children, for early years children, but it may be that you have a different opinion as we go through the presentation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about its use with practitioners and some information about using the methodology with children too. I would consider it to be an innovative methodology because it's not creative like lots of the other things that we've done today, but it isn't a traditional way of collecting data. Anybody who is interested in doing something like this in their research, I definitely recommend you being involved in another project if you can, where you are a participant. So before I started using this, I was involved in a mentoring project at Wolverhampton University, and it just is such a different way of being able to present your perspective than answering directly research, like interview questions, for instance. I'll go through what is involved in Q methodology in a moment, but some of the reasons why I use Q methodology is because I really seek to gain the complexity in participants' perspectives, and I look for commonalities within those perspectives. And so one of the things that Q can do for you is group participants together based upon commonalities of perspective, but still represent the complexity of those perspectives too. So I'll talk about that as we go through the presentation. But I started using Q methodology in 2008. That was when I began my PhD, and my PhD was on teachers' positions of inclusion, both two agendas, inclusion and standards in primary schools, and at that time whether they could be practically implemented in tandem. And what I found from previous research before my PhD was that I felt like often teachers were trying to tell me what they thought I wanted to hear, and not necessarily what they thought themselves or the practical difficulties they were experiencing. it felt like they were telling me what they were told to do or what they thought I wanted to hear from them instead. So I wanted to find a methodology or research method that would enable me to really find out their perspectives instead, and for them to not feel like there was a right or wrong answer. And with Q methodology, I feel like that is possible. I'm also an interpretivist qualitative researcher, and I up until this point had not done anything with statistical analysis or anything like that. And Q methodology, in order to group participants' perspectives together, uses factor analysis. And so that was something that really I knew nothing about when I was a PhD student. But I did seek comfort in the fact that because it's a methodology in its own right. So it's not just a research method, it is a way of thinking about research. So researchers with different positions can use this methodology and adapt the research design based upon their position as a researcher. So I felt comfortable in retaining my interpretivist qualitative position as a researcher, and using Q methodology in a way that meant I could develop and produce qualitative data collection and findings. But for me, there's a part where you input the data into this software. There is one of the software that you can use for Q methodology is called PQ method, and I quite liked having a little bit of distance from my data and having part of it analysed kind of distanced from me, and then me interpreting that data once I completed the factor analysis process. There was something quite I felt that in some ways that made it that was a strength to my analysis. And also one of the other reasons why I wanted to use Q in my PhD was that from previous research I realised that, I found that whilst teachers had a strong position on standards in schools, so things like SATs, league tables, testing, assessment, the curriculum, they didn't necessarily have a strong opinion on inclusion. And often if I said like, what is your perspective on inclusion or inclusion agenda or something like that, it felt like some of the teachers just didn't really know quite what to say back, or that their responses were not a sort of, well, this is exactly what I think about it, And so with Q, you use a set of statements. And in those statements, it kind of gives the participants something to work with. So you're not just saying questions to your participants and waiting for them to give you a response, not quite knowing whether they have an answer to that question, because they're sorting a set of statements instead. So what is involved in Q methodology? I just would pre-warn you, for anybody who is interested in this, there is a lot of complicated language around Q methodology, things like Q sets and Q sorts, and if you want to use it, particularly at doctorate level, you will get to know and understand this language. I haven't included that in this presentation, but it has its own language, but there is a basic structure really with collecting the data. The beginning thing that researchers do is they generate what's called a concourse, which is basically a set of statements that if you were using this at doctorate level, it would be exhausting perspectives on a given subject. But in any other kind of research, you just try to aim for as many perspectives as possible. You usually do that by doing a literature search and doing a literature review that influences the development of those statements. But also often Q methodologists use a focus group where they may take the beginnings of a set of statements to a focus group and say, what do you think about this? Am I missing any perspectives? And work with that focus group of relevant participants to develop those statements in the first place, and do a pilot potentially with those participants or another set of participants before you then go forward with main data collection. Then what happens with those statements is you then go out to your participants, and you can do this in lots of different ways. So when I did my PhD, I had these huge, it was a bit like Blue Peter special cardboard, like the big pieces of cardboard with like in the top right corner like a really large board where they could sort the statements onto that, and there was already the column at the top that explained how they would sort the statements. Or you can use online, so you can do an online sort, or you can do it in other ways, and I'll explain another way in a second, which kind of wasn't what I wanted to do, but was what I had to do because of time constraints with my participants, but I'll leave that for a moment. So there's lots of different ways that you can do it. But basically, you go to your participants with these set of statements and you ask them to sort them based on a particular condition of instruction. So you ask them to sort them based upon something. So in my PhD, I asked them to sort them based upon their perspective of inclusion, and then I asked them to sort them based upon their perspective of standards. And the set of statements had statements that considered both agendas, because I wanted to see how they worked alongside one another and where they place the statements for both in relation to one another, so we're all in the same set of statements. And then that data is sent through something like PQ method as a factor analysis process to look at commonalities to group participants' perspectives. One of the things that I find really fascinating about this is even just visually, so by doing this and having like that image in the top right hand corner, you can see so much about somebody's perspective on any given subject, really, because you're not asking. So you could ask an interview question on all of those statements, but then you would only get a response back individually about that particular question. Whereas by doing this, you're able to see how important every statement is in relation to all the other statements, and you can pick up on that and talk about that with your participants. One of the things that I wished I did at doctorate level and I didn't was ask permission to record the conversation as the participants sorted the set of statements and we chatted at the same time. I didn't, and I wished I had, because there was amazing things said as they were sorting the statements. But it is fascinating to see, and in its own right is qualitative data. So you can analyse each individual's set of statements, how they've placed their set of statements qualitatively, as well as doing a factor analysis process. If you only wanted to do this and do a qualitative analysis of all the individual card sorts, that's more of a card sorting research method as opposed to Q methodology. You need to do the factor analysis process too in order for it to be considered Q methodology. But there's lots of things that you can do with that. So I have done things, for instance, where I've looked qualitatively at the card sort and I've colour coded it, or I've had particular themes of statements that I've colour coded to look at the pattern of distribution of the statements across the participants. So there are so many different things that you can do with that. The same as looking just purely at what statements are placed in the most extreme columns of the distribution grid. So if you see, I don't know if you can see very well, but on the image you have each extreme is like strongly agree to strongly disagree, and the middle is more the neutral column. So often with participants and particularly with children, I will ask them to sort the statements into 3 piles initially, and then ask them to spread out either their agree pile or their disagree pile, and ask them to select the 1 or 2 dependent on the distribution grid shape, but ask them to pick 1 or 2 that's their most agreed, for instance, or most disagreed statements, and place those on the grid, and then work their way in, if that makes sense. Then we go through the process of working the way into the middle of the distribution. It helps the process a little bit, rather than just starting with a whole pile of statements and asking them to sort them straight onto the distribution grid. Some of the other things to think about in terms of if you were using it with children is you can use visual images instead of written statements. As I said, there is a process. So I particularly with children, I will sit down with them and go through this process of sorting out the piles first, and then going through each of those piles and supporting children to put on the distribution grid. Having said that, I've done that with groups of children. So we had a a project that we recently completed called the Head Start Evaluation Project, and Head Start is a childhood resilience programme, and so we were evaluating the programme, but at the same time we were asked to look at children's perspectives on their resilience. So we developed a set of statements based upon resilience, but without using the word resilience, because obviously that's a complicated term to use. So we developed this set of statements, and we asked children to rank order the statements on the distribution grid in exactly the same. In fact, I think that one was one of the distribution grids we used for the Head Start project. What I did, and this is part of the bullet points here, is I always talk to participants beforehand about the fact that there is no right or wrong way of sorting the statements. So it's really important, particularly with children, that they understand that we're not looking for something specific. We're asking them for their perspective on it. And I use I and my and first person in my statements. In all of the projects I use Q, because it's more personal to them. And we do that with children too. And that project, the Head Start project, started. The youngest child was 9 in that project, and the eldest was 17, and they had the same distribution grid. Some of them needed more support than others, but for the most part, we were doing it in both education and community settings with a handful of children at a time. Usually with 2 researchers, so that we could kind of go around and check everybody was happy. But I think that the lovely thing with this is that children can ask for help if they, primary age and secondary age children can ask for help if they need it. But equally, they can carry on doing this if they don't want to communicate and interact with us. So we were able to step back and enable them to do this without having to sort of be present for all of it, I suppose, if that's what the children would prefer, and so having said that, there is this thing about making sure that your participants aren't necessarily talking to one another as they're sorting their distribution grid, because obviously then they could influence one another's perspectives. But it was fascinating because we did this other example where we used in the Explore University evaluation project. That project was with students who live in low socioeconomic areas, and looking at how much they aspire to higher education. Again, there was a programme, so Explore University was trying to support students, these students, to aspire to higher education, but they wanted to know their overall perspectives of whether they wanted to go to higher education or not, and we did that one online. So and the coordinators of that programme carried out the data collection for us, and they reported back to us that the young people didn't really ask that many questions. They mostly just got on with it themselves and completed the Q-sort without much assistance. Yeah, so that's 2 examples. And just to say, Q methodology is not normally used as an evaluation tool. However, what we did was we just had a couple of statements in there about the programme at the same. So as well as looking at this overall perspective of childhood resilience or about aspiring to higher education, we just had a couple of statements in there about how beneficial the programme was to them. And again, because of the way that you sort the statements onto the distribution grid, you're able to see then how important those statements were in relation to all the other statements, as well as doing the factor analysis. Too. So an example of how I've used it in the early years. So I started a project on the early years pupil premium back in 2016. So it was a year after the early years pupil premium was implemented. I then went on maternity leave, and so then continued the project in 2017 and completed it in 2018. So my data collection was actually 2017 to 2018. I was really interested in it on a personal as well as a professional perspective. Around that period of time, I have an adopted son who was eligible for early years pupil premium, and the practitioner, one of the practitioners at the time, asked me what they thought I would want the EYPP funding to be used for him, because there was no there was no need to close the gap for him. He had no developmental delay. They didn't really know what to use the funding for him, and so they came to me and asked me what I would like to have done, you know, what my perspectives were, I suppose. And from a professional perspective, I felt that so the EYPP funding, the eligibility criteria is all low-income families, and looks after children who have been in care for 1 day or more, which includes all adopted children. So that's a huge range of experiences that you know children may have had and may be having, and the emphasis, like pupil premium, is placed on closing the gap and supporting that. And I was interested and intrigued of what practitioners thought about that when there may not be a gap to close. And also it's such a small amount of money compared to pupil premium, so I was interested about how that was being used and if it was effective or not. So I wanted to do this project, and I managed to speak to 20 owners and managers from 19 settings in one local authority. There's an example of some of the statements that I used, and what I did was I went to the local authorities good to outstanding group initially, and developed the statements with them, and then I did the data collection with the 20 owners and managers. The difficulty for this particular project was access. I didn't have a lot of time with the participants at all, actually. I tried to go into different settings, and that wasn't possible at that time. So I was given by the local authority half an hour with these participants in one room while they were on an owners and managers event, and I wanted to use Q. So what I did was, there was actually 50 people in the room, but I made it very clear that you know, it was voluntary. They didn't have to do it if they didn't want to. And I set up images of the distribution grid. So rather than my large boards, I had like an A4 sheet in the middle of the tables that showed the shape of the distribution. And I had these little small statements instead, so they could sort the statements onto just the table instead of a board. And then some of the local authority members of staff, the early years advisory team, supported me by kind of just checking everybody was okay and going around the tables and making sure everyone was all right. And I'd obviously prepped them beforehand. But I had half an hour and I collected my Q sort data, my Q methodology data from all of them in that period of time, because that's all I had with them. And these were the key results from that. So I published 2 academic papers from this, and also provided a report back to the local authority that supported them with how they then decided to use EYPP funding after that. There were 3 factors. So these are so when you use factor analysis in Q methodology, it generates these different groups with commonalities of perspective amongst those groups. So each of these factors is a group that has commonalities in their perspectives. I use titles to help explain what those groups' perspectives are, but also then I have what's called a factor interpretation. So I then use the statements that represent that group's perspective to explain in more detail what that perspective is. And basically what happens is, at the end of the factor analysis process, you get kind of the same, you get the same distribution grid that you've just seen on the slides earlier, but that is representative of that one group's perspective. Does that make sense? So then you analyse that as that group's overall commonalities of perspective. So this is what these are the findings for that particular project. So factor 1 had 8 participants included, and their perspective was there are limitations to the EYPP funding. The application process has got to change. Factor 2 had 7 participants, mostly over 10 years experience, and their perspective was the EYPP funding is beneficial, but it's not accessible to all who need it. And the third factor had 4 participants, mostly nursery managers of up to 12 years, of over 12 years experience. And their perspective was the EYPP funding has application and eligibility issues, but it's essential funding. It can support eligible children's development and others in the setting. So what the findings the overall findings was that it showed, and it was if you can see there's both similarities and differences in those groups' perspectives, it showed across the groups that EYPP for these participants was not working at that time. There were consistent issues with the application process and eligibility criteria, and the use of Q meant that I could really represent the complexity and the commonalities of participants' perspectives. So just quickly, because I know I'm running out of time, I knew it was going to be hard to do this in 20 minutes. In terms of why use Q, it can be time efficient, dependent on how you decide to do data collection. As I say, I wouldn't ordinarily want to do it so quickly in the way that I did it for the EYPP project, but access can be an issue, so it can be time efficient in that way. You can use additional qualitative data collection methods with it. So I always use report sheets at the same time as after I've asked the participants to sort the set of statements, I then give them this report sheet that asks them for their overall perspective on that subject area. And I ask them for some qualitative information about why they've placed the statements in the most extreme columns, and I embed those direct quotes into my factor interpretations. Developing the actual statements in the first place, one of the benefits is being able to do a focus group, go to relevant participants, and there is flexibility in the approach. One of the things that I find fascinating about using Q methodology is that I often find something out that I don't expect to find out, and it's just because of the methodology itself that, you know, and this is one of the things why I like the distance, I suppose, with some of the analysis, that often things come up and I just don't expect it. So for instance, the Explore University project, I thought that family and friends would be really influential to how much the participants aspired to go to higher education. But actually the results of that project was that it was so much more their own self-perception and what teachers thought of them than their family and friends for that sample of participants. And that came from Q. So it sometimes can kind of bring out things that you don't expect. Some of the limitations can be access and time. Ideally, it's good to do it one-to-one. And yeah, I think that I had 40 statements in my PhD research, and I asked them to sort the statements twice, and that could take up to an hour per participant one-to-one. So it can be time consuming if you choose to do it in that kind of way. You have to also make sure that participants don't think you know something about them that they don't know about themselves. When I did my pilot study for my PhD, I went back to, I often do post-Q sort interviews where I go back after I've analysed the data, and they were talking to me like I knew something about them that they were like, and what did you find out? Like I'd run some sort of test on them. So I started doing this thing where I go back with brief descriptions of each group. And when I go back in the interviews, then I give them to them and say, what do you think, which group do you think that represents you? And then I talk from there with them. So subjectivity is really important in Q methodology. So I'm giving it to the participants and saying, what do you think? And what's fascinating about that is that I went back a year after in my PhD, and some of them had a different perspective, but they were able to explain why they had a different perspective, and that could have been an experience with a particular child or a move to teaching a different year group. There were variables associated to the changes in their perspective, and I got to talk to them about that in those interviews. Obviously you need to have additional data collection methods to really access individual perspectives too, in more detail, and it took me about 6 months to understand the factor analysis process, so it takes a little bit of time, but when you've got your head around it, it's fine. So just to briefly say, there is a Q methodology special interest group, so if you're interested in that, please email me, or if you have any questions. And there are there's an association of Q methodologists. I'll add all of that kind of stuff to the chat just in case you're interested in it. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, Helen, I went over. I knew I'd do that.
That's absolutely
You didn't put your 2-minute card up to me.
I didn't, because I thought you were finishing. You didn't need it. It's fine. It's only a couple of minutes, and Gary's there, so we know he's safe, so that's fine. Zita, thank you so much. There's been lots of really interesting conversations because it is so different to everything else. lots of questions about how it can be used, and I think I might need you to go and answer some of them because they're quite specific about application of that. People talking about what an amazing afternoon. Some people have had to go, which is a shame. People like playing with the different research methods and recognising that they've all got some value here. Right, there's a good question to know. Could we perhaps be used as a starting point to an interview, for example? In my doctoral project, I'm currently doing wide-reaching online survey, which will be followed up with interviews with sample of participants, professionals and parents. Could it be incorporated into a wider set of methods, or can the whole project be designed around this?
Yes, it can, but I would say that ordinarily it would be that would be your methodology, and then the other research methods are part of then that research design. So a questionnaire and interviews and things would be incorporated into using Q methodology, as opposed to Q methodology being fitted into more traditional data collection methods, really, if that makes sense, because it's a methodology and way of thinking about research. You'd have to then be able to defend why you only use that for part of your data collection, whereas if that's your overarching methodology, then all the other things would fit in as part of your research design instead.
Very full answer. So Hannah, Hannah Malpass, that's your answer. I guess the best thing to do is, you're not sure or want to talk some more about it, is to email Zita and look at some of the resources. And I think what you said there, Zita, is exactly what we've been talking about. You know, it's the difference between a method and a methodology. It's about how we approach our research. And I think one of the key the things, and I love this phrase that's just come out. Somebody, I can't remember who it was it Joe, saying it's like being invited into a secret garden of researchers, all the things that they've seen so far today. And we've still got Gary's presentation on videoing and outdoors, so I'm very excited about that.
That's going on to our feedback of the event.
Yeah, but it's you know, it's just people recognizing that, okay, this is something else that's different and a different way of approaching things that's perhaps not necessarily in our lexicon in terms of research, because it appears more quantitative than qualitative. But I think you've given a good account of how it can be both, and it is both. And
I think it's one of those things that, you know, at doctorate level, I was constantly asked why I wasn't using something just like a focus group, and I really wanted to use something innovative and different, and I think, and actually it really helped me, because by the time I did my Viva, I really was very good at justifying why I use Q methodology. But it is, you know, I think it is seeking to do things in an unconventional way, I suppose, and not just, you know, you know, traditional data collection methods are great and well used, clearly, but it's good to also think outside the box, and that's exactly the reason why we chose to do this book in the first place, isn't it? To provide more information on doing that, and
that it's okay. As long as you can justify what you're doing and why you're doing it, it's okay to do it. You know, we get sent down these lines and directed by certain supervisors, or you've got to do it this way, but actually you don't. As long as you're prepared to argue your corner and present a cohesive argument for doing it, then you can be creative, and it just produces so much more interesting data. Okay, this over to you, Zita, to introduce Gary.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks, Helen. Well, I need to try to remember how to start my presentation.
That's the tricky bit.
Oh, that's great. So I'd like to welcome our final presenter. This is Gary Beauchamp, and he is Professor of Education at Cardiff Metropolitan University, and he's going to talk to us about videos outdoors with young children. Thank you, Gary.
Okay, just check that everything's working, because I've been having a few Teams challenges. Can you all see a PowerPoint, or can somebody tell me that they can see a PowerPoint?
Yes,
we can.
Perfect. Okay, so just to take up the point that Helen made just now, having examined lots and lots of PhDs, it's much better to do one method well than lots of methods badly. So just an aside comment, one comment really well is much more preferable than a multitude of them. And also it's less things to answer questions on. So I'm going to talk today about videoing outdoors with young children. I'm talking on behalf of a load of colleagues that you'll see at the bottom there, Chantal, Cheryl and people. It's really important at this stage to say this, what I'm going to talk about is a real project, which ended up publication in an international peer-refereed journal, but everybody on the list there comes at different stages of their career. I'm at probably one end and getting old and past it, whereas the others are at much more the beginning of their career. But everybody in the project did different things. So I did nothing at all on the data collection for this project, but quite a lot on the writing, whereas Sandra and Chantal, for instance, did a large amount of data collection and very little to the actual writing, but a lot on the analysis. So it's planning things out, and I want to stress that at the start. A couple of you have been to our campus, I can see on the thing. We're lucky that we have a little bit of woods. It's not this lovely woods in the picture, incidentally, but it's it's to prompt me to say it. So we've got a small woodland site actually on the campus, and so we take children in there. We've got a little outdoor centre next to it, and this is a real project. So these are lessons. So based on a paper which I'll give you a link to later on, but it's also based on reflecting afterwards. So the context of this, there's a growing variety of use of video, and I've put a few of them here. Now, some of my slides have got quite a lot of words on them, but the intention is I know this is being recorded. So if you want to watch it back, you can just pause and read these in more detail. So people have done video diaries, they've done video stimulated reflected VSRD, you might hear it called. I've done that with young children, synchronous interviews, asynchronous video show. You can see the different types of thing that are going on there. So although video is widely used, I still don't think it's perhaps mainstream as it could be at the moment, particularly with very young children, and I'll talk about that now. So we're talking about the use of video with young, but I put all children, but I think a lot of what I say is you just adapt. One of the reasons using video is it's a natural method. You haven't really got training. It's a lot of it's point and click. Now, in the case of our project that I'm talking to you about, these were 4 and 5-year-olds in this woodland setting giving a free play setting, and they wore cameras, which I'll come back to in a minute. And they didn't need any training because we just turned it on and off they went. But the idea is it's quite a natural method to use. We gave children free play opportunities in this project, but on the other hand, we couldn't have done it any other way. We can't follow them. It would look very odd, us chasing them around with video cameras through the woods. So the things like this, where the range of it, you're deliberately not constrained, they can go off and do things. You can't do any other way, even with handheld video cameras. And the thing about this one is it gives a very unique child's view of the play and the interactions with each other and with the environment. And I'll show you a tiny clip later on and explain why it's only tiny a bit later. But the idea is that you can see what they see and what they're doing, and it's often away from adults and sometimes away from other children. So the types of cameras that we used in this project, and I'd advise you to sort of think about, one is a chest mounted. It's like a GoPro mounted on their chest. There's a little thing that they wear, harness that they wear, and it's mounted on their chest. The one we got most useful data though, I've got from people, glasses that people wear when they're skiing or doing things like this, which have cameras built in. So we took the lenses out of them and they just wore these cameras, which looks very cute. But you can literally see what they're saying and hear what they're saying because it's got a microphone built into it. So you can follow these features of interactions very well, and you get the things you don't often get: gaze, facial expression, movement, alongside talk. And you can review it again and again and again, which is the beauty of the video. But aside from an audio recording, you do get these facial expressions, and it's fascinating watching that as you go along. The disadvantage is we found the chest cameras, the children were 4 and 5, they were tiny. Even though the cameras were small, it was slightly obtrusive. In the end, though, they got quite used to it, and they actually labelled it was, can the camera group come here? Or, so they adapted to it really well. But at times it got in the way, which is this camera's distractor type idea. The glasses were actually a little bit too big for them. They were so tiny. But one of our colleagues actually designed these stretchy, fancy headbands with braided up, and the children actually quite like wearing them after that to keep them on their head. And to start with, they were a little bit aware, but like young children, they just carried on. They didn't really notice it. But we always gave them the choice of what to wear, when, how long, and often they just forgot they were there, particularly even actually the ones on their heads. But when they were engaged in play, they just forgot. So there was quite a lot of ethical, and I saw in the thing I said I would talk about ethics, and I think I want to make a distinction here between procedural ethics and ethics in practice. So procedures, the things that we all have to do, like ethics forms and ethics committees. But ethics in practice is once you actually start doing it, and I'll give you some examples of that. But it's an important distinction in the use of video particularly, because ethics in practice, constant revisiting of ethics becomes even more important. So we had a whole load of procedural stuff. You have to get child or parental consent, assent, whatever you want to call it. And obviously it has to be age appropriate. In this case, for these 4 and 5-year-olds, it was a pictorial thing. but how we explained the use of the video both during and after was quite challenging. In practice, we gave them free choice, but they were free to wear it or not. So some wore it every week all the time, only once every other week, and some halfway through. But the ethical in practice was that we gave them this free choice. And the tension for us as researchers was basically when they didn't wear the camera, we lost the data. But ultimately, if we want their voice, them involved as an active participant, we had to give them that choice. And the last one was the reporting, the consent and identification. Now I'm going to show you a really quick clip next, 15-20 seconds. But we had 7 weeks of data with about 10 cameras each for a half an hour. So you can imagine the amount of data you end up with, which don't underestimate actually when it comes to video, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But the idea of playing a clip, if we played it locally, would someone know them? Would someone recognize their voice? And so on and so forth. So I'm just going to show you a little clip for two reasons. One is to show that you can anonymize it, but just to also give you a tiny insight into what you see. This is a child who's gone off on his own with a bit of rope, which some of you might start worrying a little bit now, but he's gone off with a bit of rope. Okay, and I'll just show you a little tiny clip, and you should better hopefully hear this person as well.
I don't touch. No. No, I'm dragging the string. The carrots are down. Yeah, I'm talking.
And I'll stop, it stops there anyway, because I had to stop it because other children come into view. But the idea here, you can see, you should be able to see, which is often, you know, quite a unique insight, but you should be able to hear as well. And this presents some of the challenges for analysis in a second now. The idea that actually it's quite hard to understand what that child is saying in places. He calls string dring. And so it took a lot of listening, very careful listening, because remember with these children, we couldn't go back and ask them for lots of reasons, primarily that they probably wouldn't remember it anyway. We could have used it as a VSRD, video stimulated reflective dialogue, where you show them the video and they ask them about it. But in this case, we just chose to do the one method is us interpreting what we thought they were doing. Now, the technical methods, this is really quick and pragmatic. We had to make sure all the cameras were charged. There are about 14 cameras altogether. That was no mean feat. We had to make sure they had a memory card in them, and that we had to buy extra memory cards because the built-in ones didn't last enough for half an hour. And also they had to be ones we could take out and download. Downloading was hugely challenging to clearly label each file. So we came up with this week 1 glasses one, code for it, but then we realized we had to label the cameras as well, and then we had to keep all of this each week in separate labeled folders, and it took us a little while. So if you end up doing this sort of thing, try and imagine this in advance. But the other thing was it was quite unexpected challenges just finding this secure storage area. We had about 130 gigabyte of data with these things, which is no mean amount of data, and it took a little while for our university to find a space for it, which we could all access and share, and was password protected and met GDPR and all these other things. So video data is actually, there's a lot of it, so just be careful of that sort of thing. The use of video, the reason for it, I would suggest to you, is this multimodal thing. And I've talked before about gesture, gaze, posture, spoken language, and all these sorts of things. The beauty of this one is that we get the visual as well as the sound part. But, and I can tell you this, it's multimodal is complex and layered, and it took a large amount of time, the analysis, and I'll explain the process in a second. But in comparison to field notes and transcripts, we could go back and be in the field, and actually look at it in real time. A lot of the staff, my colleagues doing it, were actually there, and it did prompt them as well to remember things. They also took field notes if they were observing in this case. And the multiple cameras was quite interesting because we could actually triangulate them sometimes and have the person that was talking to the other person and actually have them side by side. So when they talk to each other, you could get the perspective of both to see what they were doing in some cases. The challenge of that was coordinating to actually get them running simultaneously to analyse them. And we decided in the end, if we just clapped at the start of before we sent them off, we'd have a point to do it. So synchronising, if you're going to view videos simultaneously, is quite important. Now the analysis, so we've done the practicalities. The analysis, I'm going to go quite quickly through this because of time and other things. There's a link to a paper here. I'll put it in the chat. It's it's one of those open access things. And the paper and the findings are reported, including the method, in great detail here. But we can't assume that images contain a single meaning. And this is the challenge that we had as a team. So I'll quickly go through this. We've got all the data collected. We've got the video stored. We've got somewhere secure we can access them and view them. And we then had to have a big screen because there was about 5 of us. We couldn't sit round one little computer. So in the end, we ended up playing on a whiteboard in a computer room so that we could all see and hear it. And incidentally, that was better because the speakers were better there. So we had to familiarise with data. 3 researchers transcribed the video, first with sound muted. They made notes of what was going on so they could focus on the actions. And then they added in the spoken language. So that's 3 people doing one aspect of 1 week. We chose a mid of the 7 weeks in the hope that most of the teething troubles would be done and it hadn't become unfamiliar. Then all of us sat down and watched this single video. We took independent notes inductively of what we were seeing. We then decided on some preliminary codes that were things that we all saw. We then went away, and you can see where the time comes in now, fitting it around everything else and around teaching particularly. We went look at different films then, complete with transcripts, which we got done, and we then did a mixture of deductive, are those codes we'd seen were there, and then any emergent things. We then viewed that clip multiple times. One of the things we found useful then was to try and generate these codes as we're going along. Codes were agreed and this initial framework established, but you can see there's quite a lot of hours in some cases of work to get to this stage, but we were fairly sure that we were getting a robust stuff. Then started to look for these themes from the codes. So the further wide, that's all of the research team, went and watched other films, analysed them independently, and we used a mixture of the deductive codes we got, but also kept in mind this open code. Are we seeing new things in this particular video of this particular child that we hadn't seen in others? We then met again, and you can see with the time, my office was quite busy in this case, what happened throughout it. And the next thing we did, we tried to use this diagrammatic stuff occasionally, but you can see this is one of the versions. It get quite problematic and quite challenging to view it. But I think the idea of trying to see links between things and grouping things together, that the grouping soft is Coggle, this particular one, which is you can use as a free one or pay. But it did help us to actually try and visualize as a group, particularly a few or 5 of us sat round, where things were going and how they linked. We then came back to review the themes and tested them and so on, okay? And we ended up with these defined and names things. One of the things was most useful for this was that we had multidisciplinary. So we had these different lenses looking at it. So my background's music, and so was one of the other. Another was early childhood. And what we saw was people saw different things. So this sort of music, play, early education type specialism, we all looked at it in different ways. And it was quite interesting, though, that there were challenges. So there was an occasion where a child was bouncing on a branch or hitting the stick. So the musicians saw rhythm and sound in vocalizing. The play people saw free play. So it was quite a challenge. But what actually happened is we then separate out separate papers for separate journals. So the data could be used to write a musical journal for one and an early play for another. So the idea that these multiple lenses not only informed the main themes, but we could then split people to try and focus on different papers. And I'd say for people at the early part of your career, that idea that don't just aim for one thing, aim for more is important. And just working towards the end, the strengths, it's temporal, it's sequential, it's real, and you can see it as they unfold. It is a natural method, as I said at the start. You don't need a lot of training to do it. The children wearing the cameras, we did get an absolutely unique insight. I know a couple of you around here have seen, we've presented at conferences some of this, and you do get a really unique insight in what they can see, which you just can't get any other way. And limitations, that member checking The early childhood children was really impossible. We couldn't go back and say, can you remember what you did 7 weeks ago, 3 minutes into this play? With older children, with adults, certainly you can do this. And this method works with all ages, which is why I'm sort of talking to you about it. They can be intrusive in free play, cameras distractor, but I think generally they didn't, after a couple of weeks, didn't take any notice at all. And the key challenge is ethics comes back. Like all good research, ethics is going on throughout the whole project. And so you revisit the ethics often, particularly video prompts you to do that. So just to summarize, video can provide a unique contribution to early childhood, particularly outdoors or other settings, but particularly that this is a case of a woodland. You get a multimodal record from a child's view, in this case of our project, but it's the same with any videos, but they took them with them wherever they went, and they were allowed free play. So as far as possible, we were thinking we were getting a fairly unique insight. It can be viewed, listened to, repeated, and lots of nuanced analysis as you go through. And that takes time. I won't underestimate it, but we planned it, that we broke it down into small tasks. Can somebody go and watch an hour of this, half an hour of this video by 3 weeks' time? And we planned it together. So there's definitely a planning stage in the analysis. Can be saved, shared, edited. Obviously, I've made a little video, which we couldn't do, but we've got to be careful of consent. Conversely, it presents technical, ethical, and organisational challenges, and you've got to consider those at the start and plan really carefully. And I'm happy to talk to anybody who wants to talk about this at another time and revisit it throughout. There were things we just had to change. And finally, video is only one tool. But going back to that throwaway comment I made at the start, this whole paper is based on one research method, in this case, based on methodology, but it should be used with care. But equally, you can use it in combination with other things as well. So I think I'm on my time for the moment. Thank you very much for listening. That's my Twitter and me. I think you can get it from there, and I'll post the article in the chat. And I think I've delivered about on time.
You did way better than me, Gary.
I'm way older than you, Zita.
The comments in the chat are so lovely. If there's any way, Gary, that you can have a look at some of them. I've got a few here, but then if you can have a look and make some comment, that would be great, if that's okay. Yeah. Louise did ask how old the children were in the video.
They're 4 to 5.
And there was a lot of comments about seeing the importance of seeing from the child's point of view. So there was a lovely comment on, you can see what they see. That's powerful, isn't it? Ruth also commented saying, love the outdoor play and use of natural materials for risky play and risk taking. So important.
It's having said that, seeing a 4-year-old disappear with a bit of rope does take a bit of nerve.
Joe,
I think that goes back to what Helen was saying about practitioners interpreting what is safe and what's right for children to do. You know, you've got evidence that actually it's okay.
And one of the things I would say in this, we talk about it in this other paper we're doing, but the idea is the biggest problem. We had LSAs and people around the sort of perimeter of the wood, but it was to stop them interfering. It was we had a couple of students as well, and we had to say to them, please don't interfere. So there was definitely something about training, if you like, other adults to what was allowed and what wasn't.
Oh, that's really interesting. Joe also commented and said, I imagine rewatching the videos brings other layers of thinking.
The trouble is, because I was sort of the old man in the group in this case, or you know, whatever, I just said, look, we have to publish this now. We have to stop. Otherwise, we'll spend the next 10 years analysing this 70 hours of data. So there does come a point, but you're absolutely right, whoever said it, it never stops. I noticed something watching that little clip then that I hadn't noticed before, you know. So yeah, but that's the beauty of it. But it's also, in terms of producing data and publishing, particularly from it, or completing a PhD or doctorate or whatever, knowing when to stop is